There is a face you have probably seen without ever thinking twice about it. Maybe it belongs to someone in your family, or maybe you passed it on the street without knowing why it stayed with you. High cheekbones, set at a particular angle. Eyes that sit deep under a pronounced brow, pale in color, but sharp in a way that feels like they are reading something the rest of the world has not noticed yet. Skin that goes almost translucent in winter, faint blue veins visible at the wrists and the temples, but then catches color differently in summer than any neighboring people you might compare it to. A jaw that carries a particular kind of set to it, not aggressive but resolute, something carved and deliberate. And the hair, which runs from deep auburn to a red that borders on copper, or to a very dark brown that carries warm undertones, or to a blonde so pale it looks almost silver in certain light. You are looking at something that geneticists, physical anthropologists, and historians have been quietly arguing about for over a century. You are looking at the face of the Scottish people. And the deeper you go into the question of where that face came from and why it is distinct from the faces of people just a few hundred miles south or east, the stranger and more layered the answer becomes. Most people assume European faces are basically interchangeable. A gradient of minor differences, a bit more melanin here, a slightly different nose shape there, but nothing that would make a scientist pause and ask a harder question. That assumption turns out to be wrong. Within the British Isles alone, the range of visible difference between populations is significant enough that forensic anthropologists can sometimes identify whether a skull came from Scotland or England with a degree of accuracy that goes beyond luck. Population geneticists mapping ancient DNA across Europe keep finding that Scotland carries genetic signatures that do not fit the tidy narrative of a continent filled and then refilled by successive waves of farmers, steppe herders, and Roman-adjacent populations doing more or less the same thing everywhere they went. Something different happened in the far northwest, something older, and it left its mark in bone and eye color and the shape of a face. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. So let us start with the question that sounds simple but opens into something genuinely strange. Why do the Scots look different from other Europeans? Not wildly different in the way that populations separated by oceans and tens of thousands of years look different, but different in ways that are specific and consistent enough to be measurable. Different in ways that ancient DNA studies have started to partially explain, while simultaneously raising questions that the old answers could not have anticipated. To understand this, you have to go back much further than you might expect. Not to the medieval period, not to the Viking raids or the Roman frontier, not even to the Iron Age tribes that classical writers described with bewilderment and a fair amount of creative embellishment. You have to go back to the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, when the glaciers that had covered the entire region were finally retreating northward. And you have to think about who was moving into that newly exposed land, where they came from, and critically, how isolated they would remain once they got there. Because isolation is the engine of divergence. It is the mechanism by which populations develop distinct characteristics over time. And Scotland, for reasons that are partly geographic and partly geological, turned out to be one of the most effectively isolated places in all of northwestern Europe, even as populations were washing back and forth across the continent with each successive wave of migration. The land itself is a fortress, not in the way a wall is a fortress, not a single hard boundary that says here and no further. More like a series of layers, each one progressively harder to cross, each one sieving out a slightly larger portion of whatever was moving through. The mountains of the Highlands run diagonally across the country in a way that disrupts the natural movement corridors that populations tend to follow. The coastline is extraordinarily fractured, broken into peninsulas and sea locks and islands, which means that the people who actually settled the place had to be competent maritime navigators, a skill set that self-selects for particular kinds of groups. The soil in much of the north and west is thin, acidic, and agriculturally marginal in ways that limited how many people could survive there during the crucial early farming period, which meant population densities stayed lower, which meant new arrivals had to work harder to displace or absorb whoever was already there. All of this geography conspired to make Scotland a refugium, a place where older populations could persist in higher proportions than they did elsewhere, because the barriers to entry were high enough to slow the process of genetic replacement that flattened the diversity of most of the rest of Europe. And when you understand that, the distinctive face starts to make a different kind of sense. It is not just a face, it is a time capsule. The first humans to enter what is now Scotland arrived approximately 11,000 years ago, following a coastline that was still being shaped by rebounding landmasses and rising sea levels. These were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, and they were not the people most of us picture when we think of Stone Age humans. They were not crude or rudimentary. They were extraordinarily skilled navigators and coastal resource harvesters, carrying with them a toolkit adapted for life along Atlantic shorelines, moving through a landscape that was simultaneously rich in coastal resources and brutal in its interior. The genetic profile of these people, which has been reconstructed from ancient DNA extracted from burial sites across the British Isles and Ireland, shows them clustering closely with a population that geneticists call Western hunter-gatherers, a broad category of Mesolithic people who spread across Europe during the period after the last ice age. But within that broad category, the Atlantic coastal branch had its own specific signature, one that carried unusually high frequencies of the gene variants associated with light-colored eyes, specifically green and blue, and with reduced skin pigmentation relative to the continental hunter-gatherer populations arriving from the east. This is something that surprises most people when they first encounter it. We tend to assume that hunter-gatherers were uniformly dark in coloring, that pale skin only came to Europe with farmers. The evidence is more complicated. The Atlantic Mesolithic populations, the people hugging the coasts of what is now Spain, France, Ireland, and Britain, show a mix. Some were dark, some carried the variants for lighter eyes. And in the specific population that settled the northernmost reaches of Britain, the frequencies of those lighter eye variants appear to have been high enough to leave a lasting mark on the people who descend from them today. There is also something specific about the skull morphology of the Mesolithic Atlantic populations that physical anthropologists have documented across multiple burial sites. A tendency toward a longer, narrower cranial shape compared to the broader, round, higher cheekbones, more pronounced orbital ridges, a particular architecture around the face that persists at higher frequencies in Scotland than in populations further south and east who received heavier doses of Neolithic farmer admixture. This is not interpretation. This is measurement. And it shows up again and again in osteological studies comparing ancient and modern skeletal material from across the British Isles. The Neolithic farmers arrived in Britain beginning around 6,000 years ago, coming primarily from continental Europe via routes that are still being mapped in detail by ancient DNA researchers. They brought with them a completely different genetic profile, one derived from populations that had moved out of Anatolia thousands of years before and spread west and north across Europe, gradually replacing or absorbing the hunter-gatherers as they went. These farmers had darker skin, darker hair, and darker eyes as a statistical tendency, and they brought with them the distinctive broad skull shapes associated with the Anatolian Neolithic. The critical thing is what happened to the original hunter-gatherer population when the farmers arrived. Across most of Europe, the answer is a familiar one. The original populations were largely absorbed, replaced, diluted to the point where only a few % of the modern gene pool in those areas derives from them. In France, in Germany, in Spain, in England, the Mesolithic ancestry was reduced to a small fraction of the total picture. In Scotland, particularly in the north and west, the process was different. The farmers came. They did not fail entirely. There are archaeological traces of Neolithic settlement across Scotland, stone circles and chambered cairns, and evidence of cattle and grain. But the mountainous terrain, the thin soils, and the climatic harshness of the far north meant that the farming package that worked beautifully in the fertile plains of Central Europe and lowland Britain worked considerably less well in the Scottish Highlands. And when the farming package underperforms, the advantage tips back toward the people who know how to hunt and gather in that specific landscape. The result was a different kind of mixing ratio. The hunter-gatherer ancestry persisted in higher proportions in the north and west of Scotland than almost anywhere else in the British Isles. This is not a minor statistical footnote. This is the beginning of the explanation for why a Highlander can look, to a trained eye, measurably different from someone raised 100 miles south in the English Midlands. It is the oldest layer of the story, and it never fully went away. But the Neolithic farmers were not the last wave. Not by a long way. Around 4,500 years ago, something happened across Europe that was so dramatic in its genetic consequences that researchers who first noticed it in the ancient DNA record used words like replacement and astonishing to describe it. From the Pontic steppe, the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, a population associated with the Yamnaya culture and its related groups began moving westward and northward with a speed that, in genetic terms, borders on extraordinary. Within roughly 1,000 years, steppe ancestry individuals had arrived in Britain and were contributing a massive proportion of the gene pool there. In some parts of Europe, steppe-related ancestry came to dominate the landscape so completely that the genetic signal of the preceding Neolithic farmers was reduced to a fraction of what it had been. In Britain as a whole, the arrival of these beaker-associated populations from the steppe zone was similarly dramatic. Ancient DNA studies have shown that within a few centuries of their arrival, the genetic makeup of people buried in Britain shifted enormously. The steppe ancestry that was essentially absent before around 2500 BCE became the dominant signal in skeletal remains dated to after 2200 BCE. This is one of the most striking demographic events in European prehistory. But even here, Scotland presents a partially different picture. The steppe ancestry arrived. It is clearly present in Scottish populations, ancient and modern alike, but the proportions are not identical to what happened in lowland England. The northwest in particular shows a somewhat higher persistence of pre-steppe ancestry, meaning the combination of Mesolithic hunter-gatherer and Neolithic farmer that was getting replaced elsewhere had a better chance of hanging on in the places that were hardest to reach and hardest to farm. So you have, by the Bronze Age, a Scottish population that is distinct not because some entirely separate group of people arrived from somewhere exotic, but because the ratio of the three main ancestry components that make up most northwestern Europeans is different there than it is almost anywhere else, and different in ways that have a visible phenotypic expression. More Mesolithic hunter-gatherer ancestry means higher frequencies of the specific gene variants for green and pale blue eyes, for particular hair textures and color tendencies, and for the skull and facial morphology that those ancient coastal populations carried. This is the fossil record in living faces. This is the deep past, making itself visible every time someone from the Highlands walks into a room. Now, there is a temptation at this point to make this story tidier than it actually is, to say that the Scots are simply more ancient, or that they preserved something that others lost, and to give that preservation a kind of romantic weight. The reality is more interesting because it is more specific. What Scotland preserved was not uniformly distributed across the country. The Lowlands absorbed different proportions of later migrations than the Highlands. The Northern Isles, Orkney and Shetland absorbed a very heavy dose of Norse ancestry during the Viking Age, which itself came with its own distinct genetic profile. The border regions showed more English and then Norman influence, and even within the Highlands, the coastal populations showed slightly different mixes than the interior populations because the coastal routes that brought new people in were different from the land routes that the interior was accessible by. What you end up with is not a single Scottish genetic type, but a series of local patterns that share a common thread of higher than average ancient ancestry relative to the European norm, but express that ancestry in different combinations depending on which particular corner of a very complex landscape you are looking at. And this complexity, this layering of very old ancestry, with successive waves that modified it without eliminating it, is what makes the question of the Scottish face such a fascinating one. It is never entirely one thing, but it consistently shows certain features at frequencies that stand out statistically, not because Scotland was invaded by Atlanteans or preserved the bloodline of some ancient people who were fundamentally different from all other humans, but because geography is destiny in ways that even sophisticated modern thinkers underestimate, and because the mountains and sea locks and thin acid soils of the north and west kept doing the same thing for 12,000 years, which is making sure that whoever lived there on terms dictated by the land, and survived or did not survive by how well they could meet those terms. The people who met those terms, generation after generation, looked a certain way, and their great-great-grandchildren still do. The story does not stop with the Bronze Age. It does not even slow down particularly. There are more waves coming, each one adding its own layer to the question, each one interacting with what was already there, in ways that sometimes amplified the distinctiveness of the Scottish population and sometimes modulated it. The Iron Age Celts, the Romans who never quite controlled the place, the mysterious Picts whose origins generated centuries of speculation before ancient DNA started giving real answers, the Norse who poured in from the east and north, the Gaelic speakers coming from Ireland, the Normans trickling in through the Lowlands. Each of these groups is part of the explanation, and none of them alone is sufficient. But before we get to those layers, there is a particular chapter in the story that deserves its own careful attention, because it involves evidence that most people have never heard of, a chain of connections that researchers only began to trace in the last few decades, and a set of implications that are genuinely strange, even after you have stripped away all the overstatement and folklore that tends to accumulate around findings like this one. It involves the Picts, and what the Picts were, where they actually came from, and what happened to them is one of the most genuinely unresolved questions in the history of the British Isles, which is saying something given the competition. The Picts are one of those subjects that have a way of making professional historians uncomfortable and amateur enthusiasts ecstatic, and the discomfort and the ecstasy usually feed each other in ways that make it very hard to get to the actual facts. So let us be precise about what we know, what we do not know, and where the interesting questions are hiding. The Picts appear in written records beginning in the late 3rd century of the Common Era, when Roman writers started using the term to describe the tattooed or painted people who lived north of the Antonine Wall. The name itself likely derives from the Latin word for painted or decorated, though some researchers argue it may also have had a Brittonic root. They occupied the territory that is now northern and northeastern Scotland, from the Firth of Forth up through Caithness and across to the western edges of the Grampians, and they left behind one of the most distinctive and puzzling artistic traditions in all of early medieval Europe, a corpus of carved stone monuments covered in symbols so precisely executed and so consistently repeated across hundreds of sites that they clearly represent a sophisticated communication system, even though we cannot read them. Nobody can read them. That is the first strange thing. Ogham script was used in Ireland and occasionally in Scotland during roughly the same period, and we can read it. Runic inscriptions from the Norse period are largely decipherable. The Pictish symbol system, which appears on at least 200 carved stones spread across a relatively compact geographic area, remains genuinely, deeply opaque. We know it is meaningful. We can identify repeated combinations of symbols that appear to follow grammatical rules, the same basic combinations occurring in similar contexts, in ways that suggest they encode something specific and consistent, perhaps names, perhaps genealogies, perhaps some combination of both. But the key has not been found. The symbols remain silent. What we do have is a growing body of ancient DNA from Pictish period burials, and the results of that genetic analysis are not what most people expected, including the researchers who did the analysis. The popular picture of the Picts, the one that circulated for most of the 20th century, was that they were an Iron Age Celtic population, culturally related to the Britons of Wales and the Gauls of France, speaking a Brittonic Celtic language, and representing essentially the same broad population as the people on either side of them, just politically distinct and geographically remote. This picture was always a bit uncertain because the Pictish language question was never fully resolved. The fragments of Pictish that survive in place names and personal names on Ogham inscriptions show clear Celtic elements, but also some elements that have resisted analysis, words and name forms that do not fit cleanly into the Brittonic pattern, and that some linguists have argued represent a pre-Celtic substratum, an older language being partially replaced by the spreading Celtic tongues but not entirely eliminated. The ancient DNA results from the last few years have complicated the simple Celtic picture in ways that are still being worked through. The Pictish period burials tested so far cluster genetically in a position consistent with being largely descended from the British Isles' Neolithic and Bronze Age populations, with the specific mixes varying by site. But some of the samples, particularly from the northern and western sites, show higher than average proportions of the older Mesolithic ancestry component, consistent with the idea that the populations in those regions had been less thoroughly replaced during the Neolithic and Bronze Age transitions than populations further south. This matters because it suggests that the Picts were not a completely uniform group. They were a politically and culturally defined entity that may have encompassed populations with somewhat different ancestry profiles, depending on where within their territory those populations lived. The people in the Northern Isles, which were within or adjacent to Pictish territory during this period, show a different genetic profile from the people in the Grampian heartland. The coastal populations show differences from the inland ones. The genetic landscape is heterogeneous in ways that a simple Celtic replacement narrative would not predict. And then there is the question of the symbols. Because the symbol system is not just unusual for its content, it is unusual for its origin. There is no precursor tradition in Celtic Iron Age art from which the Pictish symbol system obviously derives. Celtic art is characterized by curvilinear decoration, interlacing patterns, abstract spirals and trumpets and triskiles. The Pictish symbols are different. They are highly formalized, often angular, and they depict a repertoire of images that includes animals rendered in a distinctive way, abstract, geometric shapes that have no clear parallel in any neighboring tradition, and objects that have generated decades of debate about their identity and meaning. Some researchers have argued that the Pictish symbol system is genuinely ancient, rooted in a pre-Celtic tradition that was already developed before the Iron Age Celtic languages began spreading into the region. If that is true, then the Picts may represent, in their artistic tradition as much as in their genetics, a population that preserved something old, something that predates the cultural uniformity that Celtic expansion imposed across much of Western Europe. This is not a fringe theory. It is an active area of academic debate, with serious researchers arguing both sides. The resolution, if it comes, will probably come from a combination of more ancient DNA data from Pictish period sites and more sophisticated analysis of the symbol system itself. What we can say with confidence is that the Picts were eventually absorbed into the emerging kingdom of Alba, the forerunner of Scotland, through a process that combined political merger with the gradual replacement of the Pictish cultural markers by Gaelic ones. The Pictish symbol stones stop being carved. The Pictish language disappears from the record. The distinctive art tradition is gradually merged into the broader insular style that was common to Scotland and Ireland. By around the 10th century, the Picts as a distinct entity are gone from history. But their genes are not gone. The populations that called themselves Pictish in the 7th century did not walk off a cliff in the 10th century when their cultural identity was submerged. They stayed in their farmsteads and their fishing villages and their hillside grazing lands, and they had children, and those children had children, and the genetic markers that were present in Pictish period burials are still present at elevated frequencies in the populations of northeastern Scotland today. A study published several years ago, examining the genetic structure of Scottish populations, found that individuals from Aberdeenshire and the surrounding region cluster in a way that distinguishes them not just from English populations, but from other Scottish populations further west. The northeastern cluster showed a specific combination of ancestry proportions that matched closely with what the ancient DNA from Pictish period burials in that area is beginning to reveal. The Picts, or at least the genetic heritage of the people who were called Picts in the early medieval period, are a living presence in northeastern Scotland. And here is where the face question returns, because the Pictish ancestry is not phenotypically neutral. It comes with specific gene variants that influence physical appearance, and those variants are part of what distinguishes Aberdeenshire from Oxfordshire. The higher frequency of certain hair colour variants, the specific distribution of eye colour genes, the skull morphology that physical anthropologists have noted in medieval skeletal collections from Pictish heartland areas versus anglicised areas further south, these are measurable differences that track back to the genetic distinctiveness of the population that the ancient DNA is now confirming was genuinely different. So when you look at someone from Aberdeen and find yourself noticing something about the planes of their face that you cannot quite articulate, something that your pattern recognition system flags as distinct, even if you do not have the vocabulary to explain it, you are not imagining things. You are detecting a real signal. You are seeing the physical expression of a deep ancestry that has been in that landscape for 12,000 years, modified and layered over time but never fully replaced. Now, There is another chapter in the story of Scottish distinctiveness that operates at a level of genetic and phenotypic specificity that is remarkable even by the standards of what we have already covered. It involves a single gene, a mutation so specific that researchers can trace its origin to a single ancestral individual, and a geographic distribution so concentrated that it forms one of the clearest examples of a founder effect ever documented in a European population. This is the story of red hair in Scotland. Red hair in humans is caused primarily by variants in the MC1R gene, which encodes a receptor involved in regulating the production of different types of melanin. When this gene functions in its standard form, it promotes the production of eumelanin, which is the dark brown pigment responsible for most hair color. When certain MC1R variants are present, the balance shifts toward pheomelanin, the reddish-yellow pigment that produces red and auburn coloring. People with 2 copies of these variants have the full red hair phenotype. People with 1 copy often have auburn tones, or red hair that is easier to mask with other genes, or simply a hair color that shifts noticeably in sunlight. Scotland has the highest frequency of true red hair anywhere on Earth. Depending on how you measure and which population within Scotland you are sampling, somewhere between 12 and 30% of the population carries the full red hair phenotype. Ireland comes close. Parts of Wales show elevated frequencies. But Scotland, particularly the Highlands and the Northern Isles, is the global centre of red hair density. This is not a minor statistical edge. It is a striking geographical concentration that requires an explanation. The MC1R variants associated with red hair are ancient in the British Isles. They have been found in Mesolithic period skeletal remains, which tells us they were present in the earliest post-glacial populations that colonized the region. They appear to have been at elevated frequency in the Atlantic coastal hunter-gatherer populations, which maps directly onto the geographic distribution we see today. The areas with the highest red hair frequencies are the areas that show the highest persistence of Mesolithic ancestry in ancient DNA studies. This is not a coincidence. This is cause and effect across 12,000 years. But there is something more specific happening in Scotland that goes beyond the general Atlantic Mesolithic pattern. The Northern Isles, Orkney and Shetland, received enormous Norse input during the Viking Age, and the Norse had their own elevated frequencies of MC1R variants, contributing to the specifically Norse-linked genetic diversity of those islands. Some researchers have argued that there were independent introductions of red hair variants from multiple source populations into the Scottish gene pool, amplified by the founder effects that occur whenever a small group establishes a new population in a geographically bounded area. Orkney is a particularly interesting case. The population genetics of Orkney is one of the most studied in Britain, partly because the island nature of the place makes it a relatively bounded genetic unit, and partly because the archaeological richness of the region, Skara Brae, the Ring of Brodgar, the Ness of Brodgar, makes it a focus of intense scientific attention. The Orcadian genome shows a distinctive profile, higher than British average Norse ancestry, high frequencies of certain MC1R variants, and a constellation of other genetic markers that distinguish Orcadians from mainland Scottish populations in ways that can be detected statistically with a relatively small sample size. This distinctiveness within distinctiveness, specific Orcadian traits within a broader Scottish genetic pattern that is itself distinct from English or continental European patterns, illustrates just how granular the regional genetic variation within Scotland actually is. Scotland is not genetically uniform. It is a patchwork, each patch reflecting the specific history of who got there, when they got there, and how effectively the landscape kept them separate from the neighbouring patches. But the red hair question opens into something even more interesting when you start looking at the cultural and historical dimensions. Because red hair was not just a physical trait in the ancient and medieval worlds, it carried meaning. It was noticed and remarked upon in a way that other hair colours were not. Classical writers describing the people of northern Britain commented specifically on their colouring in ways that suggested it was salient and distinctive enough to be worth recording. Later medieval traditions, both within Scotland and in neighbouring regions, associated red hair with particular temperamental qualities, sometimes complementary in the warrior tradition sense, sometimes stigmatised in the later periods when religious and folkloric associations began to attach to it. The Reformation period, in particular, produced some of the most virulent anti-red hair folklore in European history, much of it originating in continental Europe and spreading to Britain, creating a strange situation where a physical trait that had been part of the ancestral population's appearance for 12,000 years was suddenly being framed as sinister or foreign. The history of how red hair was perceived tells you a great deal about how outside observers related to the Scottish people specifically, and it is worth sitting with the peculiarity of that. Here was a population that looked a certain way because of a specific, deep ancestry rooted in a specific geography, and the way they looked was significant enough to others that it generated centuries of commentary, sometimes admiring, sometimes hostile, always marking the distinctiveness as something requiring explanation or response. The Scots knew they looked different from most of the people they encountered. They did not need genetic testing to tell them that, and in their own tradition, they had their own explanations for why, explanations that were embedded in mythology and clan genealogy, and the kinds of stories that populations tell themselves about their origins when they do not have the tools of modern science but still feel the weight of the question pressing on them. Those stories are worth examining, not as literal history, but as cultural data, as evidence of how a population processed its own distinctiveness across centuries of contact with other groups who kept noting and remarking on and sometimes using that distinctiveness as a way of defining the Scots as other. Because the story of how Scotland was defined by its neighbours, and how Scotland defined itself in response, is woven into the larger question of the real reason for the distinctive appearance of the Scottish people in ways that go beyond genetics into the territory of cultural identity, political history, and the long, slow feedback between how a group is perceived and how it perceives itself. There is a moment in this story that most histories of Scotland skip over because it is not dramatic enough. It does not involve a famous battle or a well-known king or a treaty that can be dated precisely and hung on the framework of conventional narrative. But it is, in some ways, one of the most important moments for understanding the question of Scottish distinctiveness, and it involves the relationship between the Scottish Highland and Island populations and a tradition of Atlantic maritime culture that connected them across thousands of miles of ocean, with people they had more in common with than anyone at the time could fully articulate. There is an idea in archaeology and population genetics that goes by the name of the Atlantic facade, and it describes something genuinely remarkable that becomes visible only when you zoom out far enough to see the entire western edge of Europe as a single connected zone rather than a collection of distinct national territories. From the Iberian Peninsula, up through Brittany and Cornwall and Wales and Ireland and Scotland, there runs a chain of coastal communities that, during the Neolithic period and the early Bronze Age, showed patterns of cultural exchange, shared monument-building traditions, and genetic similarity that cut across the geographic distances between them with an ease that seemed impossible given the technology available at the time. These were not land connections, these were sea connections. The Atlantic Ocean, which we tend to think of as a barrier, was in this period functioning as a highway. The Neolithic people who built megalithic monuments along the western coasts of Europe, the massive chambered cairns and passage tombs and stone circles that still stand in Orkney, in the Outer Hebrides, in Brittany, in Iberia, were in contact with each other in ways that left traces in both the architectural traditions and, more recently confirmed, in the genetics. A study comparing the ancient DNA of Neolithic populations from across the Atlantic facade found genetic clustering that crossed national boundaries and reflected maritime contact rather than overland proximity. The Neolithic people of Orkney showed genetic affinities with Neolithic populations from the Iberian Peninsula that were closer than their affinities with some contemporary populations from Central Europe, despite the fact that Iberia is roughly 3,000 kilometers away, and Central Europe is roughly half that distance. The sea routes were the connections that mattered most during this period, and the sea routes ran up and down the Atlantic facade with a regularity that the monument traditions make clear was sustained over centuries. This Atlantic connectivity is one of the reasons that Scottish Highlanders and certain populations in the western parts of Ireland, Wales, and Brittany share genetic markers that distinguish all of them, to varying degrees, from their respective inland and eastern neighbours. They are all, to different extents, the inheritors of this ancient maritime world that flourished along the Atlantic edge during the Neolithic and early Bronze Age, before being partially disrupted by the great inland migrations of the Beaker period and subsequently by the Iron Age Celtic expansions that came primarily overland from the east. The partial disruption is the key phrase. The Atlantic facade populations were not replaced by these later arrivals, they were modified by them. The maritime populations had geographic advantages that inland populations lacked when it came to maintaining genetic continuity across disruptions. If you can put your family in a boat and sail to an island 10 miles offshore, you can survive cultural upheavals that devastate your mainland neighbors. If your economy is based on the sea rather than on arable farmland, you are less vulnerable to the military advantage that steppe ancestry warriors brought with their horses and copper weapons, because they could not follow you onto the water with the same ease they could pursue you across a plain. The Scottish Islands, in particular, functioned as genetic reservoirs throughout repeated disruptions of mainland populations. The Outer Hebrides, the Inner Hebrides, the Northern Isles, all of these served as refugia in the strict biological sense, places where populations could survive in higher genetic continuity than was possible on the mainland, and from which they could repopulate adjacent mainland areas when the disruption passed. This island refugium effect is detectable in the ancient DNA from these regions, which shows higher proportions of pre-Bronze Age ancestry, persisting further into the Bronze Age and Iron Age than comparable mainland sites. So, by the time you get to the Norse period, which is the next major layer in the genetic and cultural story of Scotland, you already have a population that is genetically complex in a very specific way, rich in Old Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, carrying the Neolithic Anatolian farmer component but in lower proportions than most of the rest of northwestern Europe, marked by the Bronze Age steppe ancestry but again in proportions that vary significantly by region, and living within a cultural framework that has been shaped by 12,000 years of intimate relationship with a specific and demanding landscape. Into this complex substrate the Norse arrived, and the Norse were not a monolithic group. The Scandinavians, who began raiding and then settling in Scotland from the late 8th century onward, came from different regions of what is now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, with somewhat different genetic profiles reflecting their own regional histories. The Norwegians who settled Orkney and Shetland and the Outer Hebrides most intensively came from Western Norwegian populations that themselves carried elevated frequencies of certain Mesolithic ancestry components relative to Eastern Scandinavian populations, because the Western Norwegian coastal populations had preserved more of the ancient Scandinavian hunter-gatherer ancestry in their gene pool than the more agriculturally settled eastern regions. The result of Norse settlement in Scotland's northern and western islands was not simply the addition of a foreign layer on top of an existing local one. It was, in some regions, a merger of two populations that were both, in different ways, inheritors of the ancient Atlantic and Scandinavian Mesolithic world. Both the pre-Norse island populations of Scotland and the Norwegian settlers who arrived from the 9th century onward carried elevated frequencies of some of the same ancient gene variants relative to the continental European norm, including some of the same MC1R variants associated with red hair and some of the same eye color variants that distinguish Atlantic and Scandinavian populations from the more heavily Anatolian-influenced populations of Central and Southern Europe. This is one of the reasons that the Northern Isles present such an interesting genetic picture today. They are not simply Norwegian Scotland. They are a fusion of two populations that shared certain ancient genetic tendencies, and that fusion produced a phenotypic frequency distribution that is in some respects more extreme than either source population individually. The red hair frequency in Orkney and Shetland, the frequency of pale blue and green eyes, the specific distribution of the light skin pigmentation genes, all of these reflect the convergent effect of two ancestral populations that had both, through different paths, preserved elevated frequencies of the relevant variants. The Norse also brought their own Y chromosome lineages, and this matters because the Y chromosome is a useful tracer for specifically male-mediated gene flow, which is relevant in a period when Norse settlement often involved Norse men taking local wives rather than Norse families migrating in complete sex-balanced groups. The R1, a haplogroup, which is associated with steppe ancestry populations and is very common in Scandinavia, is elevated in parts of northern Scotland relative to the rest of the British Isles, but the specifically Norse-associated subgroups of R1A are particularly elevated in the Northern Isles, consistent with the strong Norse male contribution to those populations. The older R1b haplogroup, which is the dominant Y chromosome lineage across most of Western Europe and the British Isles, has its own internal structure that tells part of the Scottish distinctiveness story. The specific R1b subgroups found at highest frequency in Scotland differ from those dominant in England in ways that reflect the different population histories of the two regions. The Scottish Highlanders show elevated frequencies of R1b subgroups associated with the older insular population, particularly the subgroup known as R1b L21, which is also elevated in Ireland, Wales, and Brittany, consistent with the Atlantic facade connection we discussed earlier. The clan system in Scotland, whatever its later political elaborations, had a genuine genetic dimension that modern surname studies and Y chromosome analysis have begun to document. Because surnames in Scotland often follow clan membership, and because clan membership traditionally traced patrilineal descent, modern men bearing certain clan surnames show elevated frequencies of specific Y chromosome lineages that cluster together in ways suggesting real descent from common male ancestors within the historical period. The MacDonalds show a pattern, the MacLeods show a pattern, the Campbells show a pattern, and these patterns, when mapped against the ancient DNA from the regions where these clans historically dominated, give you a picture of how the clan system functioned genetically as a mechanism for preserving certain lineages in high frequency within bounded geographic territories. This is not a trivial point for the face question. If certain phenotypic traits are associated with specific lineages, and those lineages are preserved at high frequency in specific geographic areas through the clan system's social mechanisms, then you have a cultural institution that is doing genetic work. The clan system, by determining who could settle where and who married whom over centuries, was inadvertently acting as a mechanism for maintaining the genetic distinctiveness of the populations within its domain. The Highland clearances disrupted this system in catastrophic ways, displacing hundreds of thousands of people from the territories where their families had lived for generations and replacing a dense, complex, locally adapted population with sheep and then eventually with managed sporting estates. The genetic consequences of the clearances are measurable. The populations that were forced off the land carried their gene pool with them into the industrial cities of Glasgow and Edinburgh and Dundee, into the diaspora communities in Canada and Australia and New Zealand, dispersing the genetic distinctiveness of the Highlands into a broader Scottish and global gene pool in ways that would not have happened through natural organic migration. But dispersal is not disappearance. The specific genetic variants that give Scottish Highlanders their characteristic appearance did not vanish when the clearances scattered the population. They went with the people into the diaspora, expressing themselves in the faces of Scottish-descended Canadians and Australians and New Zealanders, who sometimes cannot explain why they look the way they look in a population that includes many other ancestry groups, but who carry in their cells the same ancient signature that has been accumulating in the Atlantic Northwest since the glaciers retreated 12,000 years ago. The diaspora connection brings up something that is genuinely relevant to the broader framing of this story, which is that the Scottish distinctiveness question is not only a question about Scotland, it is also a question about what happens when a genetically specific population disperses into a larger world, and how that dispersal shapes the receiving populations in ways that are often invisible to the people experiencing them, but visible in the genetic record decades and centuries later. The Scottish diaspora is enormous relative to the size of the source population. There are more people of Scottish descent outside Scotland than there are people living in Scotland, by a significant margin. The communities that absorbed Scottish migrants, in North America particularly, were often absorbing a phenotypically distinctive population that, in certain regions of Canada especially, became locally dominant in a way that imprinted Scottish physical characteristics on the regional gene pool at frequencies that still stand out in population surveys. Nova Scotia, Cape Breton, Prince Edward Island, parts of Ontario, parts of Appalachia, these regions show elevated frequencies of phenotypic markers associated with Scottish origin, that have not been diluted away, even after several generations of mixing with other ancestry groups. This is how genetic distinctiveness propagates. Not just by staying put in a homeland, but by moving in concentrated enough groups to numerically influence the new population, and then reproducing at rates sufficient to maintain the genetic contribution across generations. The Scottish face, then, is not only something you see in Scotland, it is something you can see in a crofter's descendant in Cape Breton, in the great-grandchild of a Highlander who came to Ontario in the 1840s, in the faces of certain families in Appalachia whose communities have been there for 8 generations, but whose appearance still carries the unmistakable signature of the Atlantic Northwest. Genetics does not respect political borders. It does not expire at the edge of the homeland. It travels with the people who carry it, expressing itself across whatever landscape they end up inhabiting, reminding whoever pays attention that the face is always a record of the past, wherever the past was experienced. We have talked about the deep ancestry layers, the Mesolithic, the Neolithic, the Bronze Age steppe, the Pictish period, the Norse, the clan system, but there is one more dimension to the Scottish distinctiveness question that is not primarily about genetics at all, or not directly. It is about the feedback between environment and biology across thousands of years, the question of how a specific physical environment shapes the people who live in it across enough generations to leave measurable traces in the gene pool, and how those traces interact with the cultural adaptations that the same environment demands. This is the territory of what researchers sometimes call gene culture coevolution, the process by which genetic changes and cultural changes influence each other over time in ways that are not always separable into tidy categories of nature and nurture. The North Atlantic coast, the part of the world that includes the Scottish Highlands and Islands, is one of the most demanding environments that any human population has inhabited continuously for thousands of years. Not demanding in the extreme sense that the Siberian tundra or the Sahara is demanding. Not a place where survival requires technology pushed to the absolute limits of human ingenuity, but demanding in a sustained, subtle way that selects over time for very specific biological traits, and that creates very specific pressures on diet, on behavior, on the metabolic and immune systems of the people who live there generation after generation. The most important of these selective pressures, the one with the most clearly documented genetic consequences, involves ultraviolet light, or more precisely, its absence. The North Atlantic coast is one of the cloudiest, most UV-limited environments on Earth during a significant portion of the year. Scotland sits between the 55th and 61st parallels of latitude, which means that even at midsummer, the sun angle is low enough to significantly reduce UV penetration of the atmosphere, and during the long winter months the UV levels are so low that the synthesis of vitamin D in human skin is essentially impossible, regardless of how much exposed skin you present to whatever light is available. Vitamin D is not optional. It is essential for calcium metabolism, for immune function, for bone development, for a range of processes that are critical for health and survival, particularly child survival and fertility, which are the metrics that natural selection acts on most directly. And the human body produces most of its vitamin D not by eating it, not primarily, but by synthesizing it in the skin when ultraviolet B radiation strikes a cholesterol precursor molecule and triggers a cascade of chemical reactions that ends with the active form of the hormone circulating in the blood. The less UV you have, the less vitamin D you can synthesize. And the darker your skin is, the less efficiently you use whatever UV is available, because melanin, the pigment that makes skin darker, absorbs UV before it can reach the deeper layers of the skin where vitamin D synthesis occurs. This is the elegant efficiency of dark skin in high UV environments. It protects against UV damage, against the mutations that lead to melanoma, against the photodegradation of folate, a nutrient that UV breaks down in the bloodstream, and that is essential for fetal development. But in low UV environments, dark skin becomes a liability because it trades UV protection you do not need for vitamin D synthesis capacity you desperately need. The selective pressure this creates is powerful and straightforward. In a low UV environment, individuals with lighter skin produce more vitamin D during the limited UV season, suffer less vitamin D deficiency, have stronger immune systems, healthier bones, more successful pregnancies, and more surviving children. Over many generations, The gene variants associated with lighter skin, lighter hair, and lighter eyes become more common in the population simply because the people who carry them do better, reproductively speaking, than people who do not. Scotland, at the extreme end of the low UV spectrum in northwestern Europe, experienced this selective pressure in its most concentrated form. The population that has been there for 12,000 years has been living through this selection for 12,000 years. The modern Scots are not the same phenotypically as the Mesolithic people who first arrived, but they are the inheritors of 12,000 years of selection for the genetic package that works best in this specific environment, modified by the successive waves of migration that added new variants and new combinations to the available pool. The skin pigmentation genetics of Scottish populations reflect this history in measurable ways. Studies of specific gene variants known to influence skin color, variants in genes with names like SLC24A5, SLC45A2, OCA2, and HERC2, show that Scottish populations carry the lighter skin-associated versions of these genes at frequencies that are among the highest in the world. Not merely elevated relative to African or Middle Eastern populations, elevated relative to other European populations. The Scottish gene pool, in terms of the specific gene variants that produce the lightest possible skin in European populations, is at or near the high end of the global distribution. This is not simply inherited directly from the Mesolithic people. The Mesolithic people carried some of these variants, but not all of them, and not always at the highest frequencies. The trajectory of increasing skin lightness in the Scottish population reflects the compounding effect of successive migrations that each brought in populations carrying slightly different versions of the relevant genes, followed by selection, in an environment that consistently rewarded the lightest outcomes. The eye colour distribution in Scotland is connected to this history, but not perfectly overlapping with it. Eye colour is influenced by many of the same pigmentation genes that control skin colour, but the selection pressures on eye colour in low UV environments are more indirect than the selection on skin colour. The connection between eye colour and vitamin D synthesis is not as strong as the connection between skin colour and vitamin D synthesis, which means that light eye colour was probably not selected for, primarily because of UV considerations, but rather spread as a package alongside the other pigmentation variants that were being selected. The pale blue and green eye frequencies in Scotland are among the highest in the world. Studies of Scottish populations find that somewhere between 25 and 40% of individuals have light blue or pale green eyes, depending on the region and the specific measurement criteria. The Outer Hebrides and parts of the Northern Isles show particularly high frequencies of the palest eye variants. This is consistent with the elevated ancient Mesolithic ancestry in those regions because the Atlantic Mesolithic populations appear to have carried the relevant gene variants at high frequency even before the strong UV selection that drove subsequent skin lightening. The hair color distribution is slightly more complicated because hair color is influenced by an unusually large number of genetic variants, each contributing a small amount to the overall phenotypic outcome, with the MC1R variants producing the specific red hair phenotype, sitting somewhat separately from the brown-black spectrum that most other pigmentation genes influence. The characteristic Scottish hair colour distribution, with its higher-than-average frequency of auburn, copper, and true red colouring alongside a dark brown that tends to carry warm undertones, reflects the combined effect of the MC1R variants and the broader pigmentation gene frequency distribution. But the environmental adaptation story in Scotland is not only about pigmentation, it is also about metabolism, immune function, and the specific physiological demands of a diet that was, for most of Scottish prehistory and recorded history, quite different from the diets of farming populations in the more fertile and climatically mild parts of Europe. The traditional Highland diet was remarkable for its reliance on animal products, particularly in the form of dairy. Scotland has one of the highest frequencies in the world of the genetic variant that allows adults to digest lactose, the sugar in milk, without the digestive distress that most of the world's adults experience when they consume dairy products. This variant, which occurs in the gene that produces the lactase enzyme, is common across northern European populations as a whole, but within that already elevated regional context, Scotland shows particularly high frequencies. The reason lactose tolerance evolved in northwestern Europe at all is a subject of ongoing research, but the leading hypothesis involves the same vitamin D story we have already discussed. Milk is a rich source of dietary vitamin D and calcium. In a UV-limited environment where skin synthesis of vitamin D is seasonal at best, the ability to digest large quantities of milk year-round gives a significant nutritional advantage, particularly during the long winter months when UV is negligible, and the alternative sources of dietary vitamin D, oily fish, organ meats, and certain other animal products may be less reliably available. The populations of the Scottish Highlands and Islands developed, over many generations, a metabolic toolkit that was exquisitely adapted to getting the most nutritional value out of the resources their specific environment reliably provided. High lactose tolerance for dairy. Genetic variants that increase the efficiency of vitamin D metabolism, even from low levels. Immune system configurations adapted to the specific pathogen environment of the wet, cold, Atlantic coastal landscape, which differs significantly from the pathogen environment of continental agricultural settlements. These metabolic and immune adaptations are invisible in the face, but they are woven into the same gene pool that produces the visible phenotypic differences we have been discussing. The genome is not a collection of independent modules, one for skin color, one for lactose tolerance, one for immune function. It is an integrated system, and populations that have been living in the same environment for 12,000 years have that environment's specific demands written through the entire system, not just in the parts that happen to be visible. This integration means that when you try to understand why Scottish people look the way they look, you cannot fully separate the answer from questions about how they ate, how they metabolized nutrients, how their immune systems responded to the specific diseases of the Atlantic Northwest, how their bodies coped with the thermal demands of a cold, wet climate. All of these are part of the same 12,000-year conversation between a specific population and a specific piece of the earth. And the conversation was not only biological, it was cultural, because the cultural adaptations that Scottish Highland and Island populations developed were also shaped by the same environmental pressures, and those cultural adaptations in turn shaped the reproductive patterns and movement patterns that determined the genetic outcomes. The shealing system, the traditional practice of moving cattle and other livestock to upland summer pastures while maintaining lowland winter settlements, was not just an economic strategy. It was a social and genetic mechanism that brought together people from different home communities during the summer months, creating opportunities for mate selection and social bonding across geographic barriers that the winter settlement pattern kept distinct. The specific kinship and marriage rules that operated within this system, which varied somewhat by region and by clan, but generally maintained a preference for marriage within the community while requiring enough exogamy to avoid the problems of extreme inbreeding, created a social structure that balanced the genetic benefits of local adaptation with enough genetic exchange to maintain heterozygosity. The result of this culturally mediated genetic management, operating over centuries, was a population structure that maintained distinct local character while avoiding the negative fitness consequences of complete isolation. The different glens and islands showed slightly different genetic profiles, but they were not so divergent that intermarriage between them produced significant outbreeding depression. They were, in the biological terminology, well adapted to each other as well as to their respective local environments. The Gaelic language tradition carried embedded within it a system of social memory and knowledge transmission that was itself a product of this environment and this population structure. The bardic tradition, the formal practice of maintaining highly trained oral historians whose function was to preserve genealogies, legal precedents, and historical narratives across generations without recourse to writing, was not just a cultural luxury. It was a functional necessity in a society where land rights, inheritance, alliance obligations, and social status all depended on the accurate preservation of who was descended from whom and what agreements had been made when. The bards were the genetic record keepers in a pre-literate sense, maintaining in oral form the information about lineages and alliances that in other cultures was written down and stored in archives. The destruction of the bardic tradition, which was targeted specifically by English colonial policy from the 17th century onward, was not just a cultural loss. It was the deliberate elimination of an information system that had been managing the social dimensions of Scottish Highlands genetic structure for centuries. When the bards were suppressed and the genealogical knowledge they carried began to be lost, the social mechanisms that had maintained the specific population structure of the Highlands were disrupted in ways that compound the physical disruption of the clearances. Both the clearances and the suppression of the bardic tradition were, in this light, not merely political or cultural events, but events with real biological consequences, because they disrupted the specifically calibrated social genetic system that the Highland population had developed over a very long time. The faces that resulted from 12,000 years of adaptation to the Atlantic Northwest, modified and layered by successive migrations and shaped by the cultural institutions that managed gene flow within the population, were being dispersed and diluted and mixed into a broader global gene pool, not through the gradual organic process of natural population movement, but through the violence of colonial dispossession. This is part of why the question of Scottish physical distinctiveness carries a weight that goes beyond mere academic interest in population genetics. It is connected to the question of what was done to the population that had developed that distinctiveness over 12,000 years, and whether what was done to them constitutes a harm to something genuinely irreplaceable. Not in the sense of racial essentialism. The Scottish physical type is not sacred, it is not superior. It is simply specific, the product of a specific history in a specific place. As interesting and as worth understanding as any other specific product of any other specific history in any other specific place. And like all such specific products, it is vulnerable to disruption in ways that its long persistence might tempt us to assume it is not. The same forces that disrupted the Highland population in the 18th and 19th centuries are visible in attenuated form in the modern period, not as dispossession by landlords backed by state violence, but as the ordinary processes of migration, urbanization, and cultural homogenization that tend to reduce local distinctiveness everywhere they operate with sufficient intensity. Scotland's cities look different from Scotland's highlands, not just architecturally but genetically, because cities draw in migrants from diverse origins and mix them together in ways that reduce local genetic clustering. This is not a complaint, it is an observation. It is simply that the specific genetic distinctiveness of the Scottish people, the thing we are trying to understand in this exploration, is a product of conditions that are not fully in operation anymore, and understanding it requires understanding what those conditions were and how long they operated before they began to change. What is remarkable is not that Scottish distinctiveness is eroding at the edges in the modern period. What is remarkable is that it persisted as strongly as it did across 12,000 years of ice ages ending, farming arriving, steppe herders coming through, Romans failing to conquer, Norse raiders settling, clan systems forming and collapsing, and colonial governments doing their systematic best to eliminate whatever remained of the specific cultural and demographic structure that the Highland population had built. Persistence across that kind of history requires something more than simply being in an isolated place. It requires that the place itself be a genuine barrier, not merely a speed bump, and Scotland, in this respect, delivered. The mountains and the sea locks and the Atlantic weather and the thin acid soils all did their work across 12,000 years, and the result is still visible today in the faces of people who have never thought about any of this, who simply look the way they look and live where they live, and carry in their cells a story that goes back to the retreating glaciers of the late Pleistocene. There is one more layer to add to this story, one more dimension of the Scottish distinctiveness question that involves not just where the people came from and what happened to them after they arrived, but what they did while they were there, and how what they did shaped the genetic and cultural legacy that defines them to this day. It is the dimension of language, and of what language preserves and transmits that genetics alone cannot carry. Language is one of the most reliable markers of population history that human groups produce, and it is reliable in a way that differs importantly from genetic markers. Genetics tracks where the people physically went and who they reproduced with. Language tracks who they thought they were, who they aligned themselves with culturally, and what social networks they maintained contact with. When these two signals diverge, when the genetic says one thing and the language says another, the divergence is almost always telling you something important about a complex social situation that is not adequately captured by either signal alone. In Scotland, the language history is complex in ways that map partially onto the genetic history, but also diverge from it in revealing ways. And understanding those divergences helps complete the picture of why Scottish identity, including the visible dimension of Scottish identity that we are calling the Scottish face, is the specific thing it is rather than something else. Gaelic in Scotland, which is the language known today as Scottish Gaelic, came primarily from Ireland. This is not a controversial claim. The linguistic evidence is clear. Scottish Gaelic descends from Old Irish, which was the language of the Gaelic-speaking kingdom of Dalriata, which straddled the North Channel between what is now Argyll in western Scotland and County Antrim in northeastern Ireland in the early medieval period. The people who brought Gaelic to Scotland were not bringing a foreign language into a linguistically empty space. They were bringing a language that already had some presence in western Scotland, possibly for longer than the historical records suggest, and they were expanding it into a region that had previously spoken Brittonic Celtic languages related to Welsh and Cumbric. The genetic signal of this Gaelic expansion from Ireland is measurable but more modest than you might expect given the linguistic impact. The replacement of Brittonic languages by Gaelic across most of what is now the Scottish Highlands did not require a complete demographic replacement of the people living there. It required political dominance, cultural prestige, and sustained contact with the Dalriatan world, but the people who shifted from speaking Brittonic to speaking Gaelic over the 5th through 9th centuries were, genetically, largely the same people who had been speaking Brittonic before. The language changed. The gene pool changed much less. This is a phenomenon that linguists and geneticists call elite dominance or language shift, and it is well documented across human history. A relatively small group with political or cultural dominance can cause a much larger population to adopt their language within a few generations without there being any significant genetic replacement. Because the incentives to speak the dominant language are so strong: social advancement, economic participation, avoidance of stigma, that people will make the shift within their own lifetimes and teach the new language to their children as a first language. What this means for the Scottish distinctiveness question is that the linguistic Gaelicization of Scotland does not map onto a genetic Gaelicization. The genetic distinctiveness of the Highland population, the elevated Mesolithic ancestry, the specific pigmentation gene frequencies, the Pictish period signature in the northeastern genetic cluster, these things survived the shift to Gaelic, speaking largely intact because the linguistic shift did not require the people to go anywhere or to be replaced by people from somewhere else. The Scottish Gaelic language carries within it an extensive vocabulary of terms for the specific features of the Highland and Island landscape, for the specific animals and plants and weather patterns and sea conditions of the Atlantic Northwest, for the social relationships and obligations of the clan-based society that the language evolved within. This vocabulary is not incidental to the question of Scottish identity. It is a record of 12,000 years of cohabitation between a specific population and a specific piece of the earth, filtered through the linguistic framework that the Gaelic tradition provided for organizing and transmitting that knowledge. When Scottish Gaelic declined, which it did progressively from the early modern period onward under the combined pressure of English political dominance, the economic disruption of the clearances, and the educational policies that explicitly punished children for speaking it in schools, it took with it a framework of ecological and social knowledge that was not simply translatable into English. The words for specific weather conditions, the terms for specific types of ground, the vocabulary of specific sea states, the kinship terminology that mapped the complex web of obligations and relationships within and between clans, all of these had developed within the specific context of the population's long relationship with the Atlantic Northwest landscape and its specific social organization. The loss of the language was the loss of a significant portion of the cultural memory that had accumulated over the entire period of the population's presence in the place. This is the connection between language and the question of the Scottish face that might not be immediately obvious. The face is a product of genetics, but the genetic history that produced the face was shaped partly by the social structures that determined who could settle where and who could marry whom and how resources were distributed across the landscape. And those social structures were embedded in and transmitted through the language. When the language began to go, the social structures that had maintained the specific genetic character of the Highland population began to dissolve and the specific process of maintaining that genetic character through culturally mediated population structure began to break down. This is not a romantic lament. It is a systems analysis. Every component of a complex adaptive system, whether biological or cultural, is connected to every other component, and the removal of one component has consequences that are not always predictable from looking at the component in isolation. The removal of Gaelic from the Highland educational system removed a piece of the system that had been managing, among other things, the demographic processes that shaped the gene pool. The consequences for genetic structure were real, even if they were not the primary aim of the educational policy. Now, the Norse contribution to Scotland's language history adds another layer that is worth examining specifically. Because Old Norse, which was the language of the Viking Age settlers who came primarily to the Northern and Western Isles, interacted with the existing languages of Scotland in ways that were complex and region-specific, and the linguistic traces of that interaction survive not only in the distinct Norn language that was spoken in Orkney and Shetland until roughly the 18th century, but in the place name strata of the entire northern and western coastal zone of Scotland. The place names of Orkney and Shetland are overwhelmingly Norse in origin. The island names, the township names, the farm names, the geographical features, almost all of them derive from Old Norse roots. This is not a superficial linguistic veneer. It represents a situation in which the pre-Norse population either was replaced by Norse settlers to such a degree that the earlier place naming was entirely lost, or adopted Norse so thoroughly that the earlier names were deliberately or gradually replaced. The genetic evidence suggests it was somewhere between these two poles, with genuine demographic replacement in some areas and rapid language shift in others. The Norse place names of the Hebrides tell a different story. There, a mixture of Gaelic and Norse names survives, with Norse names concentrated along the coasts and on the smaller islands, and Gaelic names more prominent in the inland and more sheltered areas, suggesting a pattern of Norse coastal settlement alongside continued Gaelic-speaking communities in the interior. This mixed naming pattern maps onto a mixed genetic pattern, with the Western Isles showing elevated Norse Y chromosome ancestry, particularly in coastal areas, while the maternal genetic lines show more continuity with the pre-Norse population. The interaction of Norse and Gaelic in the Hebrides produced, in the medieval period, a distinctive cultural synthesis associated with the Lords of the Isles, a series of Gaelic-Norse ruling families who dominated the west coast from the 12th century onward, and whose court culture combined Gaelic literary and legal traditions with Norse political and maritime traditions in a synthesis that was recognized as distinctive by contemporaries both in Scotland and in Ireland. The poetry produced at the court of the Lords of the Isles draws on both traditions. The political institutions were a creative hybrid. The language of the court was Gaelic, but it was Gaelic saturated with Norse loanwords, particularly in the vocabulary of the sea, of ships, of seafaring and navigation. This cultural synthesis is itself a kind of face. Not a biological face, but a cultural face, shaped by the same process of geographical encounter and prolonged interaction that shaped the biological face of the populations involved. And it is no coincidence that the populations who produced this cultural synthesis, the Hebridean Gaelic Norse communities of the medieval period, were also the populations whose genetic profile shows the specific mixture of ancient Atlantic Mesolithic ancestry and Norse admixture that we have been discussing. The culture, the genetics, the language, and the landscape are all telling the same story from different angles. They are all describing the specific outcome of a specific set of encounters and interactions in a specific place over a very long period of time. There is a curious parallel between the Scottish situation and situations that researchers studying ancient populations in North America have documented in certain coastal and island contexts. And it is worth pausing to note it because it illuminates something about the general mechanisms that produce the kind of long-term genetic distinctiveness we see in Scotland. In certain Pacific Northwest coastal communities, researchers studying both genetics and material culture have found evidence of population continuity across the periods of significant cultural disruption and reorganization, similar to what we see in the Scottish case. Small communities living on islands or in geographically bounded coastal inlets maintained population genetic continuity for thousands of years, while the inland populations around them went through significant demographic changes, associated with major cultural transitions. The geographic refuge provided by the specific landscape allowed them to persist through disruptions that were obliterating the genetic continuity of less geographically protected populations. The parallel is not exact. The Pacific Northwest situation involves different ancestry groups, different timescales in some respects, and different mechanisms of isolation. But the general principle, that geographic complexity at the edge of continents, at coastlines fractured by islands and inlets and mountain ridges dropping to the sea, creates conditions for population persistence that flat, accessible interiors do not, is consistent across both cases. This principle is one of the reasons why the study of Scottish genetic distinctiveness has implications that go beyond Scotland itself. It is a case study in how geography creates and maintains human diversity, a demonstration of the mechanisms by which the physical world shapes the biological and cultural outcomes of human populations. Understanding it has value not just for understanding Scotland, but for understanding the general principles of how human diversity is generated and preserved. There is also a specific connection between the Scottish case and the question of how very small founding populations can leave outsized genetic footprints on the populations that descend from them, a question that is relevant not only in European prehistory but in the history of populations across the globe, including in the Americas. When a very small group of people establishes itself in a new territory and reproduces in isolation for many generations, the specific gene variants that were present in that small founding group become disproportionately represented in the resulting population. Variants that were at very low frequency or absent in the broader source population can become common, sometimes very common, in the descendant population, simply because of the accident of which individuals were in the founding group. This is what geneticists call the founder effect, and it is one of the most powerful generators of population distinctiveness in the human story. The repeated founder effects that shaped Scottish genetic history, the small groups of Mesolithic hunters who first arrived in post-glacial Scotland, the Neolithic farming communities establishing themselves in geographically bounded territories, the Norse settlers arriving in the Northern Isles, and founding island communities that remained demographically semi-isolated for centuries, the clan founders whose male line descendants became proportionally very common in specific territories through the social amplification of the clan system, all of these produced founder effects that compounded on each other over time, creating a genetic profile that reflects the random accidents of which specific individuals happen to be the progenitors of which specific communities, as much as it reflects the deterministic effects of natural selection and geographic isolation. The red hair story is, in this light, partly a founder effect story. The MC1R variants that produce red hair were present in the founding Mesolithic population of Scotland at some frequency. They were perhaps amplified by a subsequent founder effect associated with a Norse-related population that also carried them. And they have been maintained at high frequency by the combination of small, effective population sizes within geographically bounded communities and the absence of sufficiently strong negative selection to eliminate them. What you see when you see a Scottish person with red hair is the preserved outcome of that chain of founder effects, filtered through 12,000 years of selection in a specific environment, maintained by a specific social structure, transmitted through a specific cultural tradition that kept the relevant population geographically concentrated and reproductively semi-isolated, long and near for the distinctiveness to become entrenched. It is a beautiful thing when you look at it that way. Not because red hair or any other feature is inherently superior, but because it is the physical signature of a specific and enormously long story, a story of people surviving in a difficult place, organizing their social world around the constraints that place imposed, and leaving in the faces of their descendants a visible record of everything that happened. The record is not complete. Genetics never gives you the whole story. The faces you see in Scotland today represent the cumulative outcome of 12,000 years of decision and accident and selection and migration and cultural choice, and many of the specific decisions and accidents and choices that shape that outcome are simply not recoverable by any scientific or historical method available to us. But enough of the story is visible in the ancient DNA from thousand-year-old burials, in the population genetics of living Scottish communities, in the physical anthropology of medieval skeletal material, in the place names that preserve the voices of people who have been silent for centuries, in the oral traditions that survived the systematic attempts to eliminate them, in the art of the Pictish stones, in the genetic structure of Y chromosome lineages that trace back to founders who lived before the Norman conquest, that we can draw a picture. Not a complete picture, but a picture specific and detailed enough to be genuinely illuminating about why the Scots look the way they do. And that picture tells a story that is not about racial uniqueness or genetic superiority or some mystical bloodline descending from special ancestors. It is a story about geography, about time, about the way that specific landscapes create specific people by imposing specific demands over very long periods, and about the remarkable durability of human population distinctiveness in the face of wave after wave of disruption and change. The Scottish face is a time capsule, and what it contains, if you know how to read it, is 12,000 years of the Atlantic Northwest. There is a strand of Scottish folklore that has circulated in the Highlands and particularly in the Hebrides for centuries, one of those stories that gets told in different versions across different communities but always carries the same essential core. It says that certain families, certain bloodlines, have always been there, not arrived from somewhere else, not descended from any known migration or invasion, but simply always there, rooted in the landscape as deeply as the gneiss bedrock that underlies much of the Northwest Highlands, which is itself among the oldest exposed rock on Earth. The local expression of this idea takes different forms in different places. In some communities it is embedded in genealogical tradition, in the claim that a particular lineage goes back beyond the memory of the oldest story anyone can tell. In others it is carried in the specifics of place name lore, in stories about particular hills or lochs or coastal features that are said to have been named by people so ancient that no account of them exists in any conventional historical source. For a long time, educated opinion dismissed these traditions as the kind of charming but unreliable mythology that oral cultures inevitably accumulate around their origins. Populations, the conventional wisdom said, were always arrivals somewhere. Nobody was always there. Every group had come from somewhere else at some point. The ancient DNA revolution has complicated that dismissal in interesting ways, not by proving that any specific group literally has been in place since the beginning, because of course the glaciers covered Scotland 12,000 years ago and nothing human was there before then, but by demonstrating that the relationship between some modern Scottish populations and the earliest post-glacial inhabitants of Scotland is closer than most researchers expected, that the degree of genetic continuity across the 12,000 years of post-glacial Scottish history is higher, in the northern and western regions particularly, than the degree of continuity seen in most other parts of northwestern Europe. When a tradition says that a family has always been in a place, what it is often trying to express, in the language available to it, is something real about the depth of the connection between that family and that landscape, something that goes back beyond living memory and beyond oral record into a time that the tradition can only gesture at. And when the ancient DNA shows that the genetic profile of modern communities in the Outer Hebrides has a higher proportion of ancestry from the Mesolithic and earliest Neolithic people of those islands than is seen anywhere else in signs, Britain, the tradition and the science are converging on the same underlying truth from different directions. The tradition is not literally accurate in its specific claims about individual genealogies, but it is expressing a real pattern of population continuity in the only language available to communities without written records or scientific tools, and recognizing that the tradition is encoding real information, imprecisely but genuinely, changes how you hear it. The Seol tradition, the word in Gaelic means seed or lineage, was the organizing concept for understanding family and community in the Highland world. You were not simply an individual, you were the latest expression of a lineage that stretched back into the past and would extend forward into the future through your own descendants and those of your relatives. The specific characteristics of the lineage, including physical characteristics that were associated with particular family lines in the way that the resemblance of relatives always makes the family dimension of physical appearance, concrete, were understood as something carried and transmitted, not as something invented fresh in each generation. This understanding is, in its broad outlines, correct. The specific gene variants that produce the characteristic colouring and facial morphology of Highland Scottish families are indeed transmitted from generation to generation along lineages that go back into the deep past. The folk understanding that these characteristics are lineage characteristics, that they run in families, that they connect living people to the ancestors who shared them, is biologically accurate, even if the mechanisms involved were not understood in the terms that modern genetics uses. The Highlanders knew that red hair ran in families. They knew that a particular combination of features, the pale eyes and the high cheekbones and the specific jaw set, appeared again and again in the same kindreds, generation after generation. They encoded this knowledge in the genealogical tradition that the bards maintained, in the kinship vocabulary that the language preserved, in the practical social calculations that determined who would marry whom, and what the likely characteristics of the children would be. They were doing applied genetics without the theory. This is not unique to Scotland. Every traditional culture that maintains close genealogical knowledge and practices demographically bounded marriage has an implicit understanding of how characteristics are transmitted through lineages. But it is particularly visible in Scotland because the Highland and Island communities maintained a combination of geographic isolation, detailed genealogical tradition, and social institutions for managing kinship that was unusually complete and unusually well documented, even in the oral record. The clan system, whatever its political and economic dimensions, was fundamentally a kinship management system. It was a way of organizing who was related to whom, what those relationships obligated, and how the physical and social landscape was to be allocated among the related groups. The genetic consequences of running such a system for centuries in a geographically bounded landscape are, as we have discussed, significant. But the cultural consequences are equally significant because the clan system also maintained a kind of extended phenotypic awareness, a broad community knowledge of which physical characteristics were associated with which lineages, which was used in the practical assessments that preceded marriage negotiations and other social decisions. The modern scientific understanding of the genetic basis of the Scottish physical distinctiveness that this cultural tradition was encoding does not invalidate the tradition. It substantiates it at a level of mechanistic detail that the tradition itself could not access. The two ways of knowing are describing the same underlying reality, one through the tools of population, genetics, and ancient DNA analysis, the other through the accumulated practical knowledge of communities living with the reality for thousands of years. There is a question that emerges from all of this that is worth sitting with for a moment. If the Scottish physical distinctiveness is real, measurable, and the product of a specific deep history, why is it not more widely known or discussed? Why is it not part of the standard narrative of British history or of European population history? The answer is several things at once. Part of it is the relatively recent origin of the scientific tools that have made the story fully visible. Ancient DNA analysis at the resolution required to address these questions has only been possible for about 15 years, and the dense sampling of Scottish populations that would be needed to fully map the genetic landscape at the regional level is still underway. The story is being written in real time, and much of what we know is preliminary. Part of it is the political sensitivity of any discussion of population genetics and physical distinctiveness that might be read as a claim about racial superiority or inferiority. The history of that kind of claim being weaponized to justify oppression, including specifically in the context of the British treatment of Highland Scots in the 18th and 19th centuries, makes researchers cautious about how they frame findings that could be misappropriated. This caution is understandable and in many ways appropriate, but it has also sometimes led to an under-communication of findings that are genuinely interesting and that do not require misappropriation to be meaningful. Part of it is the way that Scottish history has been told within the British narrative, which has often treated Scotland as a peripheral region whose distinctive characteristics are cultural curiosities rather than the visible expression of a deep and specific population history. The tendency to fold Scottish distinctiveness into a broader British narrative that is centred on England has obscured the degree to which the Scottish case is actually more interesting, genetically and historically, than the English case, precisely because the preservation of older population layers makes it a more complex and informative record of European prehistory. But the story is coming out now. The ancient DNA studies are multiplying. The The population genetics surveys are getting more detailed and more comprehensive. The physical anthropology data is being integrated with the genetic data in ways that are producing a more complete picture than either discipline alone could provide. And the picture that is emerging is consistent with what we have been describing throughout this exploration. Scotland, particularly the northern and western parts of Scotland, is a refuge for ancient European population characteristics, in the same sense that a nature reserve is a refuge for species that have disappeared from the surrounding landscape. Not because anything deliberate was done to preserve those characteristics, but because the geography that makes the place difficult also makes it durable, and the combination of difficulty and durability has preserved. Across 12,000 years of repeated disruption and change, a population that retains unusually high proportions of the ancestry of the people who first arrived as the glaciers were retreating. That population looks a certain way. It has specific frequencies of specific gene variants that produce specific visible characteristics at population scale. And those characteristics, the pale eyes, the red and auburn hair, the specific facial morphology, the translucent skin with its particular relationship to sunlight, are not random or arbitrary. They are the visible surface of a very deep story, written in the genome of a people who have been shaped by one of the most demanding and beautiful landscapes in the world for as long as any human population has been there. There are researchers today who spend their careers working on different pieces of this puzzle. The physical anthropologists who measure the craniometric differences between medieval Scottish skeletal populations and contemporary English ones, the population geneticists who are extracting ancient DNA from coastal burial sites and finding Mesolithic ancestry proportions that surprise them, the linguists who are tracing the Pictish language question through the fragmentary evidence of Ogham inscriptions and place names, the paleoecologists who are reconstructing what the Scottish landscape looked like at different periods and how human activities changed it over time, the historians of the clan system who are trying to understand how the social institutions of the Highlands shaped demographic patterns across centuries. None of these researchers is working on the question of why Scots look different from other Europeans. That is not how science is organized. Science proceeds through specific questions asked with specific tools, and the synthesis that emerges from many specific questions asked independently is usually assembled only in retrospect, when someone sits down and tries to see what all the different threads have in common. The thread they have in common is the story we have been telling. A specific population, in a specific place, shaped by geography and time and culture, and the accumulated accidents of who happen to arrive when and stay long enough to matter demographically, producing, across 12,000 years, a visible distinctiveness that is not mystical, not evidence of divine election, not the sign of any special status or superiority, but simply the inevitable result of being a specific kind of people in a specific kind of place for a very long kind of time. The next time you see a face that makes you think of Scotland, a face with those pale eyes and that particular bone structure and that colouring that sits outside the main clusters of European phenotypic variation, you are seeing 12,000 years of Atlantic weather and thin acid, soil and mountain barriers, and sea locks and island refugia and founder effects, and natural selection and cultural institutions that kept a population coherent long. Enough for all of these forces to do their work. You are seeing the Atlantic Northwest written in bone and pigment and the expression of ancient genes that have been passing from parent to child since before any of the stories we tell about history even began. The Scottish face is not a mystery in the sense of being inexplicable. It has an explanation, a long and specific and genuinely fascinating one. But it is a mystery in the deeper sense, the sense in which any 12,000-year human story is a mystery, because the full depth of it goes beyond what any single telling can contain. The mountains that shaped the people are still there. The sea locks that isolated the communities are still there. The gneiss bedrock, 2.5 billion years old, that underlies the Western Highlands is still there. And somewhere in that landscape, the genes that the Mesolithic hunters brought in when the glaciers were retreating are still there too, expressed in faces that look out at the same Atlantic horizon their ancestors looked out at 12,000 years ago. The story did not end. It is still being written in the faces of every generation that inherits it. And the most honest thing we can say about it is that it is one of the most specifically human stories on Earth. because it is the story of what happens when you put a small group of remarkable animals in a beautiful and demanding place and leave them alone long enough for the place to become part of them. Scotland became part of the Scots, and you can see it in their faces if you know what you are looking at and you know enough of the story to understand what you are seeing. There is something quietly profound about that, something that deserves more attention than it usually gets in the mainstream discussions of human history and population biology. We spend a great deal of time thinking about the large-scale movements of populations, the great migrations and invasions and replacements that restructured the genetic landscape of Europe and the rest of the world over the last 20,000 years. Those large-scale processes are genuinely important and fascinating. But the smaller story, the story of what happened in the places where the large-scale processes were resisted or slowed or modified by geography and culture, that story is in some ways more interesting, precisely because it is less expected. The Scots remind us that Europe is not genetically uniform even today, that the homogenizing forces of migration and cultural spread did not fully erase the older diversity that existed before them, and that geography is still doing what it has always done, which is shaping human populations by making some places easier to enter and leave than others. The specific features of the Atlantic Northwest, those mountains and sea locks and islands and thin soils, are not just a scenic backdrop to the story of the Scottish people. They are the author of the story, working with the slow pen of evolutionary time and the invisible ink of gene frequency change. And the text they have written, across 12,000 years of continuous engagement with a specific population, is the face of Scotland. Read it carefully. It took a long time to write. And in a world that is becoming more mobile and more mixed with every generation, the time in which it can be read at all, in the faces of people who have mostly not left the place that wrote them, is itself finite, not ending soon, not ending in a way that is catastrophic or tragic, simply changing, as everything changes, as the populations of the islands and the glens and the coastal communities continue to engage with the rest of the world in the ways that all human populations always have. But for now, in the faces of people from the Outer Hebrides and the Northern Isles and the Grampian Heartland and the Western Glens, the text is still there. The pale eyes, the specific colouring, the particular structure of the face that trained observers have been noting for a very long time without always being able to say precisely why it matters, that is the deep past making itself present. That is geography written in flesh. That is 12,000 years of the Atlantic Northwest looking back at you. And now, as the details of ancient DNA and paleoclimate and clan genealogy and Pictish symbol stones begin to settle into something approaching rest in your mind, consider what an extraordinary thing it is to look at a face and know, if you know enough of the story, that you are looking at the accumulated outcome of everything that happened to a people across more time than most of us can truly imagine. Not the history that is written in books, not the history that begins with literate civilization and kingdom building, but the deeper history that is written in the genome and in the landscape and in the oral memory of people who knew their own place better than most of the literate world ever knew theirs. The Scots are distinct because the Atlantic Northwest made them distinct, because geography is destiny when the timescale is long enough, because the same forces that shape stone over geological time also shape people over human time if the conditions are right. And in the mountains and the sea locks and the fractured coastline of the far northwest of Europe, the conditions were right for 12,000 years. That is the real reason. Not mythology, not mysticism, not a claim about special bloodlines or divine favor, but the quiet, specific, endlessly interesting truth of what time and place and the accumulated depth of human experience do to a population when they are given enough of all three. Sleep well, knowing that the faces you see in the world around you are all, every one of them, carrying stories as old and as specific and as worth knowing as this one. Some of them have just been studied more recently than others. The Bronze Age transition in Scotland is one of those chapters in the deep story that gets compressed into a few sentences in popular accounts, but that, when you slow down and look at it carefully, turns out to be a long and geographically complicated process, whose regional variations tell you a great deal about the mechanisms that produce the specific genetic patchwork that underlies the modern Scottish distinctiveness. The people associated with the Bell Beaker cultural package, named for a distinctive style of pottery that spread with extraordinary speed across large parts of Europe between roughly 2800 and 1800 BCE, represented a population movement of unusual genetic impact. They carried with them the ancestral profile that had developed on the Pontic steppe, a grassy region north of the Black Sea, where populations related to the earlier Yamnaya culture had developed the combination of herding economy, horse domestication, and wheeled vehicle technology that gave them a significant mobility and military advantage over the farming populations they encountered as they moved westward. The genetic signal associated with these beaker-using populations is unmistakable in ancient DNA data from Central and Western Europe. Where they went, the proportion of steppe ancestry in the skeletal record increased dramatically and rapidly within a few generations, and the proportion of the preceding Neolithic farmer ancestry fell correspondingly. In Britain, the transition was particularly sharp. Studies examining large numbers of ancient British genomes have found that the genetic profile of individuals buried in Bell Beaker-associated contexts is so different from the genetic profile of individuals buried in preceding Neolithic contexts that researchers have used words like population replacement and demographic transformation to describe what happened. But the distribution of this transformation within Britain is what matters for the Scottish question. The beaker-associated population replacement was not spatially uniform across the British Isles. It was most complete in the south and east of England, where the geographic accessibility, the flat or gently rolling terrain, the productive agricultural land, the proximity to continental routes of entry, all combined to make penetration relatively easy for a mobile population with a horse-assisted pastoralist economy. As you move north and west, the completeness of the replacement declines in measurable ways. In Scotland, the beaker cultural package did arrive. The characteristic pottery, the individual inhumation burial practice replacing the Neolithic collective tomb tradition, the copper and then bronze metalwork, all of these appear in the Scottish archaeological record from the late 3rd millennium BCE onward. But the people burying their dead with beaker-style goods in Scotland show a somewhat different ancestry profile than the people doing the same thing in southern England. The steppe ancestry proportion is present, but, in northern and particularly northwestern regions, lower. The older combined Mesolithic and Neolithic ancestry persists at higher proportions in Scottish beaker period genomes than in contemporary English ones. There are several reasons this might be true, and they are not mutually exclusive. The Highland geography physically constrained the movement of a pastoral population that depended heavily on cattle herding and horse-assisted mobility. Horses are remarkably difficult to move across the kinds of terrain that characterize the Scottish Highlands. The mountain passes that modern roads navigate with ease, the beaker population could establish itself in the more accessible parts of Scotland, the eastern coastal plain, the river valleys of the Tay and the Forth, the more open terrain of Caithness and the Orkney Islands. But penetrating the western glens and the island chains required a maritime competence that a primarily pastoral steppe-derived population did not necessarily have as its default skill set. The people who already lived in the western glens and the island chains were maritime specialists. They had been for thousands of years. Their economy was built. They were not easy to displace with the tools and strategies that worked on the eastern coastal plains, and so they were not fully displaced. They were modified by the new arrivals at their accessible margins, but their core persisted. The physical anthropology of Bronze Age skeletal material from Scotland adds another dimension to this picture. Studies comparing the cranial morphology of Bronze Age individuals from different Scottish regions have found differences that track the geographic pattern of steppe ancestry penetration. Individuals from eastern and southern Scottish Bronze Age sites show a higher frequency of the broader, more rounded skull shapes associated with the steppe ancestry populations and their Neolithic farmer predecessors, while individuals from the far northwest and the islands show a higher persistence of the longer, narrower cranial forms associated with the older Atlantic Mesolithic and Neolithic populations of that region. This is not a trivial observation. Skull shape in humans is substantially heritable and differs systematically between populations with different ancestry profiles. The physical anthropologists who measured these differences in the 19th and early 20th centuries did not have the tools to understand why the differences existed. and some of them drew from those differences conclusions that were culturally and politically biased in ways we recognize as wrong. But the underlying observation that Bronze Age skeletal populations in different parts of Scotland show measurable craniometric differences that map onto regional ancestry differences has held up reasonably well even as the interpretive framework around it has been completely revised. The modern understanding, grounded in ancient DNA that the early physical anthropologists could not have had, is that these craniometric differences reflect the same regional variation in Mesolithic versus Neolithic versus steppe ancestry proportions that the genetic data shows. The skulls were measuring something real. They just lacked the context to understand what they were measuring. The Iron Age, which follows the Bronze Age in the Scottish sequence, brought further complications to the regional picture. The spread of Celtic languages into Scotland during the first millennium BCE was associated with populations moving primarily from the south, from the areas of Britain and continental Europe where Celtic languages had already established themselves. These populations carried their own genetic profile, somewhat different from both the preceding Bronze Age population and the earlier Neolithic, and their movement into Scotland followed the same accessibility gradient that earlier migrations had followed. Easiest in the south and east, progressively harder as you moved north and west. The Iron Age population of southern Scotland and the eastern coastal strip shows greater affinity with the broadly Celtic populations of England and continental Europe than the Iron Age population of the Highlands and the Western Islands does. The Highlands and Islands once again preserved a higher proportion of the older local ancestry, not because the Iron Age Celtic populations failed to arrive there, but because when they did arrive, they were fewer in number relative to the established local population, and the mixing ratios therefore preserved more of the older genetic character. By the time the Romans arrived on the southern frontier of what is now Scotland in the 1st century of the Common Era, the genetic landscape of the region was already a complex layering of very ancient and more recent ancestry components, distributed in a regional pattern that mapped closely onto the topography. The Romans, famously, never fully controlled the territory north of Hadrian's Wall, and the Antonine Wall which they built further north was held for only a few decades before being abandoned. The highland populations that classical writers described as unconquered, wild, tattooed, and militarily formidable were populations that had maintained a higher proportion of their pre-Roman ancestry, precisely because the geography that made them difficult to defeat in warfare also made them difficult to reach with the demographic pressures that accompanied Roman political control. The Roman frontier, and then Hadrian's Wall as the definitive boundary of Roman Britain, became one of the more significant demographic dividing lines in British prehistory, not because it was a perfect barrier to gene flow, it certainly was not, but because it marked the boundary of the densest Roman settlement and the associated migrations of people from across the Roman world that accompanied and followed the army. South of the Wall, the genetic composition of the British population was being modified by the arrival of soldiers, merchants, and administrators from Gaul, from the Rhineland, from the Balkans, from North Africa, from the Eastern Mediterranean. North of the Wall, particularly in the Highland zone, that modification was minimal. This is another layer of the story of why Scotland, and particularly Highland Scotland, preserved older population characteristics that had been diluted elsewhere. The Roman frontier was not the cause of the distinctiveness. It was one more mechanism that reinforced a distinctiveness that was already in place before the Romans arrived, because the same geography that the Romans found difficult was the geography that had always slowed the pace of demographic change. When the Roman occupation of Britain ended in the early 5th century, the population that had been living north of the Wall for 4 centuries, largely without Roman demographic modification, was already significantly distinct from the population of what is now England, which had been 4 centuries in the process of absorbing a complex multi-ethnic Roman world. The post-Roman period, with its reorganization of political boundaries and its new waves of migration from continental Europe into the south of Britain, the Angles and Saxons moving into England, deepened this distinction rather than closing it. The Anglo-Saxon migrations into England introduced another significant genetic input into the southern British gene pool, one that is clearly visible in the ancient DNA of post-Roman skeletal material from England. The people who came from the areas of modern Denmark and northwestern Germany to settle what became England brought yet another genetic profile into the mix. One weighted toward continental northern European ancestry, with its own specific frequency distribution of pigmentation genes and other phenotypic markers. This Anglo-Saxon admixture is largely absent from the Highland Scottish gene pool, reinforcing the divergence between what was becoming England and what was becoming Scotland. So, by the early medieval period, the genetic divergence between the population of Highland Scotland and the population of England had been accumulating through multiple independent mechanisms for well over 1,000 years. The Mesolithic founding populations had been different in their proportions of the relevant ancestry components. The Bronze Age steppe ancestry had arrived at different intensities in the two regions. The Iron Age Celtic modifications had penetrated the south more than the north. The Roman demographic influence had barely touched the Highland zone. The Anglo-Saxon migrations had reshaped England without reaching Scotland. Each of these factors had contributed independently to the divergence, and because the factors were additive rather than competing, the cumulative effect was larger than any single factor alone would have produced. By the time anyone was writing down histories and trying to describe the differences between the peoples of Britain, the genetic divergence was real and substantial enough to be visible in the faces of the people involved, even if nobody at the time had the framework to understand why it existed. The Viking Age, which we have already discussed in the context of the Norse settlement of the Northern Isles, added another modification to both the Scottish and the English gene pools, but in different ways and through different routes, reinforcing rather than homogenizing the differences between them. The Norse, who settled Orkney and Shetland and parts of the western coastline of Scotland, came primarily from Norway, which itself had a somewhat different genetic profile from the Danish populations that contributed most to the later Danelaw settlements in eastern England. Different source populations entering different regions through different routes at different periods of time, all deepening the existing differences rather than erasing them. By the time the Norman conquest reshaped English political society in the 11th century, the divergence between the Scottish and English gene pools was deep enough, and the geographic barriers between them significant enough, that the Norman influence on the Scottish gene pool was considerably more limited than its influence on the English one. The Normans came to Scotland, they settled in the Lowlands, they married into the Scottish aristocracy, they left their mark on the Scottish surname tradition and the Scottish feudal land system, but they did not penetrate the Highland zone in the same way or to the same degree, and the Highland gene pool absorbed the Norman input at the margins rather than at the core. The cumulative result of all of this, by the high medieval period, was a Scottish Highland population that was among the most genetically distinct in northwestern Europe in its preservation of the oldest ancestry components, and a Scottish face that reflected that distinctiveness in the specific frequency distribution of the gene variants, controlling the visible characteristics we have been discussing throughout this exploration. When historians and contemporary writers in the medieval period noticed and remarked upon the distinctive appearance of the Highland Scots, they were not making things up. They were accurately observing a real difference that had a real and deeply grounded cause. The observation was accurate even if the interpretation was often wrong or shaped by the political interests of whoever was doing the observing. The Highlands were routinely described as wild, as uncivilized, as different, by writers who were working within frameworks that associated cultural development with proximity to Rome and the continental Christian tradition. These writers were using the physical distinctiveness of the Highland population as a visual marker for a cultural difference that they interpreted through the lens of civilization versus barbarity. The physical difference was real. The interpretive framework was a product of the observer's cultural biases, rather than anything intrinsic to what they were observing. This misappropriation of accurate observation for purposes of cultural stigmatization is a pattern that runs through the entire history of how the Scottish Highland population has been described by outsiders, from Roman writers through medieval English chroniclers, through early modern colonial administrators, through 19th century theorists of racial hierarchy. In every period, the distinctive appearance of the Highland Scots was noted as a marker of difference, and in most periods, that marker of difference was loaded with negative connotation by observers who had an interest in framing the Highland people as less than fully civilized or fully rational or fully deserving of the political and economic rights that were being denied them. Understanding the actual genetic and historical basis of the physical distinctiveness helps denaturalize this stigmatization. The Scottish Highlanders looked different not because they were less developed or less civilized or less worthy of consideration. They looked different because they had been in a specific place for a very long time, and the place had shaped them in specific ways. The distinctiveness was the product of a deep and specific history, not a sign of arrested development. This reframing matters not just as a corrective to historical misrepresentation, but because it offers a model for how to think about all forms of human physical distinctiveness. Every population that looks a certain way looks that way for reasons that are rooted in geography and time and the accumulated history of who went, where, and when, and under what circumstances. No physical characteristic of any population is evidence of developmental superiority or inferiority. All physical characteristics are evidence of specific histories in specific places, and the more specific and deep the history, the more specific and interesting the characteristic tends to be. Scotland offers one of the most specific and deep histories in Western Europe. The face that history has produced is correspondingly specific and interesting, and the story of how that face came to be what it is, traced back through the Viking settlement and the Pictish period and the Iron Age and the Bronze Age and the Neolithic, and all the way back to the Mesolithic hunters, following the retreating glaciers into a newly exposed landscape 12,000 years ago, is one of the most genuinely fascinating stories in the entire history of the human species on this island. It is a story worth telling carefully, worth understanding in its full complexity, worth being slow to reduce to any single simple explanation, because the reality is always more interesting than the simplification. And in this case, the reality is interesting enough that any simplification of it constitutes a genuine loss. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over certain places in the Scottish Highlands in the late evening, when the light has gone from directly overhead to horizontal, when it comes in at that low angle that makes everything longer and softer and somehow more itself. The gorse on the hillside looks more golden than yellow. The water in the loch loses its daytime flatness and starts catching the light in a way that suggests depth rather than surface. The shadows in the corries go deep blue, and the stone, the ancient gneiss and Torridonian sandstone that underlies so much of the northwest, begins to look warm rather than grey. People who have spent time in that light, even people who arrived from somewhere completely different, often describe something that sounds like recognition, not the recognition of a remembered place, because they have not been there before. Something more like the recognition of a type of thing that they were expecting without knowing they were expecting it, a particular quality of the physical world that matches something they did not know they were carrying. The geneticists who study the Scottish population would not phrase it this way. They would talk about ancestry proportions and gene frequency distributions and the phenotypic consequences of elevated Mesolithic admixture. But what they are describing and what the person standing in the Torridonian evening light is experiencing are, in the end, related things. The genome that produces the pale eyes that respond to that light in a particular way, that makes skin behave differently under that low-angle illumination than darker skin does, that gives certain people a particular relationship to the specific photon environment of the Atlantic Northwest. That genome was shaped in that environment over 12,000 years. It was calibrated by that light, selected by the specific UV conditions of those latitudes, refined by the demands of survival, in a landscape where that particular quality of late-evening illumination is a regular feature of the world. The recognition is genetic memory in a loose but meaningful sense. Not the mystical kind of genetic memory that science fiction invokes, not the literal storage of specific experiences in the genome, but the more real and more interesting kind, the encoding in the biological characteristics of a population of the demands and conditions of the specific environment in which that population has been living for a very long time. The person from Aberdeenshire, standing in the evening light of the Grampians, is not remembering anything, but their body, their eye structure, their skin, their metabolic calibration to that specific quality of light, is expressing the accumulated outcome of 12,000 years of ancestors who stood in that same light, and whose ability to function effectively in it determined whether they survived and reproduced and passed on their genome. This is what it means to say that the Scottish face is a time capsule. Not that it stores specific memories, but that it carries, in its visible and invisible characteristics, the encoded history of a relationship between a population and a place, written in the language of gene frequencies and phenotypic expression, readable, if you have the tools to read it. The modern scientific tools for reading this kind of encoded history are developing rapidly. Ancient DNA analysis has already transformed our understanding of European population history, revealing migration events and population replacements that were invisible in the archaeological and historical record. New computational methods for analyzing the structure of modern genomes are allowing researchers to identify ancestry components at finer and finer levels of geographic and temporal resolution, distinguishing not just whether someone has British Isles ancestry, but which part of the British Isles, and within Scotland which region, and within a region which community, down to levels of specificity that would have seemed impossible even 20 years ago. The picture that is emerging from this work, and that will continue to be refined as more data accumulates, is consistent with the story we have been tracing throughout this exploration. Scotland, particularly Highland Scotland and the Western and Northern Islands, preserves a higher proportion of ancient European ancestry than most other parts of northwestern Europe. That ancient ancestry is associated with specific phenotypic characteristics that appear at higher frequencies in Scottish populations than in the broadly comparable populations of England or continental northwestern Europe. The distinctiveness is real, measurable, and the product of a specific deep history that the tools of modern science are only now beginning to fully map. The public health implications of this genetic distinctiveness are worth noting as a practical matter, though they are often overlooked in discussions that focus on the aesthetic or historical dimensions of the question. The elevated frequencies of pale skin pigmentation variants in Scottish populations, which are the product of the vitamin D selection story we discussed earlier, have consequences that go beyond appearance. Pale skin synthesizes vitamin D more efficiently in low UV conditions, but it is also more vulnerable to UV damage in high UV conditions. Scottish emigrants to Australia, New Zealand, and other high UV environments show elevated rates of skin cancer relative to their host populations, a direct consequence of carrying a skin pigmentation profile that was optimized for the Atlantic Northwest, rather than for subtropical or tropical UV levels. This is not an abstract or theoretical concern. It is understanding the genetic basis of this vulnerability and understanding that it is specifically the product of 12,000 years of selection in a low UV environment helps both affected individuals and the medical systems that serve them understand why the vulnerability exists and what can be done about it. The elevated frequency of certain immune system configurations in Scottish populations, which may be related to the ancient ancestry components we have discussed, is another area with potential public health relevance. Some studies have suggested that populations with higher Mesolithic ancestry proportions show different distributions of immune system gene variants than populations with higher Neolithic or steppe ancestry proportions, and that these differences may influence susceptibility to certain autoimmune conditions, infectious diseases, and inflammatory disorders. The evidence for specific links is still preliminary, and the research is ongoing, but the principle that ancestry composition influences immune system characteristics is well established, and Scotland's distinctive ancestry composition is therefore likely to have distinctive immune system consequences that are worth investigating. The metabolic distinctiveness of Scottish populations, including the elevated lactose tolerance frequencies and the potential for differences in vitamin D metabolism efficiency, is similarly relevant to understanding patterns of nutritional disease and deficiency that show geographic clustering. Scottish populations historically showed high rates of rickets in the industrial cities of the 19th and early 20th centuries, a direct consequence of taking a population that had spent 12,000 years developing efficient vitamin D synthesis in the outdoor light of the Atlantic Northwest and moving them into dense urban environments where both UV exposure and dietary diversity were sharply reduced. The body that worked beautifully in the Highland landscape was poorly matched to the tenement clothes of Victorian Glasgow, and the consequences were visible in the bone deformities of children who grew up without adequate vitamin D, in a climate where their bodies were already pushing the efficiency boundaries of skin synthesis in low UV conditions. Understanding these connections between genetic ancestry, environmental adaptation, and health outcomes is not just historically interesting, it is medically useful, The more precisely we can map the specific genetic characteristics of specific populations and the environmental pressures that shaped those characteristics, the better equipped we are to understand why certain populations show certain health patterns and what interventions might be most effective for them. This practical dimension of the Scottish distinctiveness question is one reason to hope that the story continues to attract the scientific attention it deserves, and that the growing public awareness of ancient DNA research and population genetics translates into sustained funding for the kind of detailed, regionally specific genetic studies that can move the understanding beyond the broad strokes into the fine-grained detail that has real practical value. The story we have been telling tonight, the story of why Scottish people look different from other Europeans, has layers that go deeper than most people imagine, and implications that extend further than most people have traced. It is a story about how geography shapes people over very long timescales. It is a story about how cultural institutions encode and transmit genetic structure across generations. It is a story about the relationship between visible physical characteristics and deep ancestry history. It is a story about how the disruption of populations through colonialism and forced migration has biological consequences that outlast the political events that caused them. And it is a story about the emerging scientific capacity to read the deep past in the genomes of living people, making visible a history that was always present but previously inaccessible. None of this story is about racial hierarchy or genetic superiority. The Scottish physical distinctiveness is not a mark of special virtue or special capacity. It is a mark of specific history in a specific place. Every population in the world has its own specific history in its own specific place, and every population's physical characteristics are the product of that history. What makes the Scottish case interesting enough to tell in this detail is not that it is unique in principle, but that it is unusually tractable scientifically, because the geographic isolation that produced the distinctiveness also left a relatively clear signal in the genetic record, and because the historical documentation of the cultural institutions that shaped the demographic structure is rich enough to complement the genetic data in illuminating ways. The people who first arrived in Scotland 12,000 years ago, following the retreating glaciers into a landscape that had just been released from under kilometers of ice, they did not know they were starting a 12,000-year experiment in what happens when a specific human population meets a specific challenging landscape and stays long enough for the meeting to become a relationship. They were just people, looking for food and shelter and a place to raise their children. They were doing what every human population has always done, trying to survive in the circumstances they found themselves in with the tools and knowledge available to them. The fact that their survival and the survival of their descendants generation after generation across 12,000 years of change and disruption produced the specific genetic profile that underlies the modern Scottish physical distinctiveness is not a monument to their greatness or to any mystical connection they had with the land. It is simply the ordinary outcome of ordinary human processes playing out over extraordinary amounts of time. Ordinary processes over extraordinary time. That is, in the end, what produces the remarkable things. The Grand Canyon was not carved in a single dramatic event. It was carved by a river moving ordinary amounts of water over an The Scottish face was not produced by any single dramatic genetic event. It was produced by ordinary people living ordinary lives in a specific place over an extraordinary number of generations. And when you understand that, when you really sit with the timescale and what it means for a place to shape a population over 12,000 years of sustained engagement, the face becomes genuinely extraordinary in the way that ordinary things become extraordinary when you see them clearly. Not extraordinary because it belongs to any special category of human being, but extraordinary because it is the visible surface of an invisible depth that goes all the way back to the moment when the first humans walked onto ground that the glaciers had just released and looked at the mountains and the sea and the Atlantic sky and decided to stay. They stayed. Their children stayed. And their children's children stayed, through everything the place and the history threw at them, through the Bronze Age disruptions, and the Pictish period, and the Norse raids, and the clan conflicts, and the English wars, and the clearances, and the industrial migration, and the modern globalization that is finally, gradually, doing what none of those earlier disruptions fully managed to do. They stayed long enough for the place to become part of them. long enough for the mountains and the sea, and the specific quality of the Atlantic light to write themselves into the genome of a people and leave a mark that is still visible today, in the faces of people who may never have thought about any of this, and who are simply who they are, products of a very long story that they carry without knowing they carry it. That is the real reason the Scots look different from every other European people. Not myth, not mystery, not the intervention of any force outside the ordinary world of human biology and geography and time. But those three things in combination, operating at scales that are large enough to produce outcomes that feel, to the people who encounter them, like they must have had a more dramatic cause than the quiet, patient accumulation of ordinary days. Geography, biology, time, 12,000 years of the Atlantic Northwest. That is the whole story, and it is, if you have been following it all the way to this point, enough to take with you into sleep. Enough to turn over slowly in the drifting mind as the details of ancient DNA and Mesolithic hunters and Pictish symbol stones and Highland clan systems begin to soften at the edges and blur into the kind of half-images that the nearly sleeping mind makes from whatever it has been. Given, the Atlantic light is always the same at that particular angle. The mountains have been there for longer than the people who named them. The sea keeps its own record of everything that has crossed it, and tells it to no one in particular, and tells it all the time. Sleep well. The story will still be there in the morning, written in the faces of a people who do not need to know it to carry it, who carry it simply by being who they are, where they are, at the end of 12,000 years of staying. When you begin tracing the specific gene variants that produce the most visually salient features of the Scottish physical type, the pale eyes, the red and auburn hair, the particular quality of the skin, you enter territory where the biology is more precise and more recently understood than most people realize. The popular understanding of genetics tends to picture it as a simple switching system. You either have the gene for something, or you do not, and the outcome follows directly. The reality, at least for complex traits like pigmentation, is considerably more interesting and more layered. The color of the iris in human eyes is determined primarily by the amount and distribution of melanin within the iris stroma, the fibrous matrix that makes up most of the iris. In individuals with dark brown eyes, the iris stroma contains large amounts of densely packed melanin granules. In individuals with pale blue eyes, the stroma contains very little melanin, and the color you see is the result of light scattering within the nearly transparent tissue, a phenomenon similar to the Rayleigh scattering that makes the sky blue. Green eyes represent an intermediate state, some melanin present but not enough to produce brown, combined with the light scattering that produces the bluish component. The genetics underlying this spectrum involve primarily two genes, OCA2 and HERC2, which work in combination to determine how much melanin is produced in the iris. A single change in one small region of the HERC2 gene, a change so specific it can be traced to a single ancestral individual who lived roughly 10,000 years ago, reduces the activity of the OCA2 gene and dramatically reduces iris melanin production, producing the blue eye phenotype. Every blue-eyed person in the world today is descended from that same ancestral individual. This is a population genetic fact of remarkable specificity. Blue eyes are not an ancient feature of the human lineage. They are a very recent mutation, about the same age as the Mesolithic populations that first began colonizing post-glacial Scotland. The frequency of the blue and pale green eye variants in Scotland is among the highest in the world, precisely because the population that carries those variants in the highest frequency is the Atlantic, coastal, Mesolithic, and early Neolithic population, the ancient founder population of the region. When that ancient population persisted in Scotland in higher proportions than elsewhere, the gene variants that were common in that population also persisted in higher proportions. The pale eyes of Scotland are the eyes of the original post-glacial colonists, preserved across 12,000 years in a population that never fully lost its founder ancestry. This is not a romantic metaphor. It is a mechanistic description of how gene frequencies work in partially isolated populations. The HERC2 variant that produces pale blue eyes was present in the founding population at some frequency. In the conditions of partial isolation that characterized the Highland and Island communities throughout most of their history, the frequency of that variant was maintained, and, in some regions, amplified by the genetic drift that occurs in small populations. The result is what you see. The MC1R story is similarly traceable in its specific mechanisms. The MC1R gene encodes a receptor protein on the surface of melanocytes, the pigment-producing cells in hair follicles and skin. When this receptor is activated by its normal signaling molecule, melanocyte-stimulating hormone, it triggers the production of eumelanin, the dark brown pigment. Several specific variants in the MC1R gene reduce or eliminate the receptor's response to this signal. In individuals homozygous for 2 copies of these variants, the melanocytes default to producing pheomelanin, the red-yellow pigment, producing red hair, freckled skin, and the particular sun sensitivity that comes with low eumelanin production. There are several distinct MC1R variants associated with red hair in European populations, suggesting that the red hair phenotype has arisen multiple times from different mutations in the same gene, rather than once from a single founder event. The specific variants most common in Scottish and Irish populations are different in their relative frequencies from the variants most common in Scandinavian populations, showing red hair, which is consistent with the genetic history we have been tracing, in which the Atlantic coastal populations and the Norse populations arrived at elevated red hair frequencies through somewhat different ancestral paths. The penetrance of the MC1R variants, meaning the proportion of people with the relevant genotype who actually express the red hair phenotype, is itself influenced by other genes in the melanin pathway. This is why you can have siblings with the same MC1R genotype but different hair colors. Other gene variants elsewhere in the genome are modifying the expression of the MC1R variants, producing the diversity of hair colors from auburn to deep copper to true red that makes the Scottish hair color distribution so varied within its general tendency toward warmer, lighter tones. The skin pigmentation picture is similarly complex. The variants most strongly associated with pale European skin are in genes called SLC2-4A5, SLC4-5A2, and a handful of others. The SLC2-4A5 variant in particular, which produces a change in an ion transporter involved in melanin granule formation, is present at very high frequency in all European populations, and is thought to have been subject to very strong positive selection in the low UV environments of Europe, reaching current high frequencies from near zero only within the last 8 to 10,000 years. Scotland, as a particularly low UV European environment, shows frequencies of the light skin SLC2-4A5 variant at or near the European maximum, consistent with the strong selective pressure for vitamin D synthesis efficiency in that specific latitude. The combination of very high frequencies of the blue-eye HERC2 variant, multiple MC1R red hair variants, and the light skin pigmentation gene variants means that Scotland has one of the most extreme combinations of low melanin gene frequencies anywhere in the world. This is not a single trait that is unusual. It is a constellation of related traits, all pointing in the same direction of reduced melanin production, all consistent with the same underlying selection pressure in a low UV environment, and all at unusually high frequencies relative to even other European populations. The evolutionary logic is compelling and internally consistent. In an environment where UV is limiting for most of the year, reduce melanin as much as possible to maximize the efficiency of whatever UV is available. This means selecting for pale skin, pale eyes, and lighter hair, all of which are associated with reduced melanin production in different compartments of the body. The specific combination of very pale skin, very pale eyes, and red or auburn hair that appears at highest frequency in Scotland represents the most extreme expression of this selection logic in the European context. And there is a feedback loop here that is worth noting. Once the frequency of pale eyes is high enough in a population, it begins to influence mate choice in ways that can amplify the frequency further. Pale eyes are highly visible and distinctive in close contact social interaction, and there is evidence from human mate choice research that eye color influences attractiveness judgments in both directions, with some individuals showing preferences for eye colors similar to their own kin group. If pale eye color was common enough in the Highland and Island communities to be the local norm, then the mate choice preferences calibrated to local norms would tend to maintain and potentially amplify it, creating a cultural reinforcement of the genetic selection pressure. This kind of gene-culture interaction in the domain of mate choice is very difficult to study rigorously because it requires reconstructing preferences and behaviors from populations that left no direct record of how they chose mates. But the theoretical mechanism is well established, and the circumstantial evidence from the geographic concentration of specific phenotypic traits in populations where those traits would have been most common in the immediate social environment is consistent with the mechanism being at least partly operative. The epigenetic dimension of Scottish distinctiveness is an emerging area of research that adds yet another layer of complexity to the picture. Epigenetics refers to heritable changes in gene expression that do not involve changes to the underlying DNA sequence, changes in how genes are read and used, rather than changes in what the genes say. Epigenetic marks can be influenced by environmental conditions and, crucially for this story, can sometimes persist across multiple generations, meaning that the experiences of an ancestor can influence gene expression in their descendants through mechanisms that are distinct from the straightforward inheritance of gene variants. The relevance to Scottish history is primarily in the context of the extreme population stresses of the clearances and the associated famine, disease, and social disruption that accompanied them. Research on other historical populations that experienced similar traumatic disruptions has found evidence of intergenerational epigenetic effects, changes in gene expression patterns in the descendants of trauma survivors that appear to reflect the physiological stress responses of the survivors being passed down through epigenetic mechanisms. Whether similar effects are present in the descendants of clearance survivors is not something that has been specifically studied, but it is not implausible that the scale and severity of the disruption left traces in gene expression patterns that persist in some form in contemporary Scottish populations. This is a frontier area of research where the evidence is still developing and the mechanisms are not fully understood. And it would be an overstatement to claim that epigenetic effects of the clearances are a documented part of the Scottish genetic distinctiveness story. But it is a direction that is worth following as the science matures, because the integration of epigenetic data with genomic data and historical records of population stress has the potential to reveal aspects of population history that neither source alone can see. The geographical mapping of Scottish genetic variation at fine resolution is itself a relatively recent development, made possible by the combination of large-scale genome-wide association studies, improved computational methods for ancestry inference, and the growing databases of genotyped individuals from geographically annotated samples. The studies that have been done show a regional genetic structure within Scotland that is finer-grained than most people expect, and that maps more closely onto historical and geographic boundaries than onto the administrative boundaries of modern counties or regions. The Orkney genetic cluster is one of the most clearly defined, showing elevated Norse ancestry and specific frequencies of pigmentation gene variants that distinguish it measurably from mainland Scottish populations. The Western Isles show their own cluster with characteristics intermediate between the Orkney profile and the mainland Highlands profile, reflecting the different mixture ratios of pre-Norse and Norse ancestry in a population that was geographically closer to the Gaelic cultural sphere than to the Norse-dominated Northern Isles. The northeastern Scottish cluster, centred on Aberdeenshire and the surrounding area, shows the Pictish period genetic signature that we discussed earlier. The lowland Scottish populations show higher affinities with northern English populations than any of the Highland and Island clusters do, reflecting the different settlement history of that region and its greater exposure to the migration streams that have shaped the English gene pool. Within the Highlands themselves, the genetic structure shows further fine-grained variation that reflects the geography of the glens and the specific settlement histories of individual communities. Communities in adjacent glens that have been separated by mountain ridges for centuries show measurable genetic differentiation at the Y chromosome level, consistent with the combined effects of geographic isolation and the clan system's influence on male-mediated gene flow. The matrilineal genetic structure, traced through mitochondrial DNA, shows somewhat less differentiation at the same geographic scale, consistent with the historical practice of wives moving to their husband's clan territory more often than husbands moving to their wife's territory. This fine-grained genetic structure is not merely an academic curiosity. It is a record of the social geography of the Highlands, the way that the clan system divided the landscape into territories whose boundaries were socially maintained and genetically expressed. Each territorial boundary in the historical Highland land system is, in principle, visible as a genetic boundary in the contemporary population if the sampling is dense enough. The glen is not just a geographic feature. It is a genetic unit, a space within which gene flow was intensive and between which it was moderated by the same social mechanisms that determined territorial rights and agricultural access. The loss of this fine-grained genetic structure, which is ongoing as rural Scottish communities continue to experience depopulation and as the remaining populations become more open to migration from outside the traditional catchment areas, is a form of information loss that is difficult to quantify but real. The specific genetic markers that distinguished one glen from the next, that recorded the specific demographic history of each community in the fine details of gene frequency variation, are being homogenized by the migration and mixing of the modern period. The information is not disappearing entirely, but it is becoming less legible as the local distinctiveness that maintained it erodes. This is the biological equivalent of what happens to a language when it loses its speakers. The language does not simply vanish. Elements of it are absorbed into the dominant language, traces of it survive in loanwords and in the speech patterns of the last speaker's descendants. But the full complexity of the system, the fine-grained distinctions that were meaningful within the community of speakers, is lost as the community disperses and the reasons for maintaining those distinctions dissolve. Scottish Gaelic is going through exactly this process in the modern period, and the fine-grained genetic structure of the Highland communities is going through an analogous process, for analogous reasons. The connection between the linguistic and genetic dimensions of this erosion is not accidental. They are both symptoms of the same underlying demographic process, the continued depopulation and social disruption of the Highland communities that began with the clearances and has continued through subsequent decades of economic marginalization and emigration. The forces that emptied the glens of people also emptied them of the linguistic and genetic complexity that those people had carried. This is not a call for any particular political response. The demographic reality of the modern Highlands is complex and involves many factors beyond anyone's simple control, and the people who live there today are as entitled to make their own choices about where to live and how to organize their lives as any other population. But understanding the historical and biological dimensions of what has been lost and what is continuing to be lost is a prerequisite for making informed decisions about what, if anything, to do about it. The Scottish distinctiveness that we have been tracing throughout this exploration, the genetic and phenotypic characteristics that make the Scottish people visibly and measurably different from most of their European neighbours, is not primarily a contemporary phenomenon. It is a historical residue, the accumulated outcome of 12,000 years of a particular kind of history in a particular kind of place. In the modern period, that residue is being diluted at the edges by the ordinary processes of migration and mixing that characterize all contemporary populations. The dilution is not catastrophic, and it is not happening faster in Scotland than in most other comparable populations. But it is happening. What remains, both in the people who have stayed and in the diaspora communities around the world that carry the Scottish genetic legacy into new generations, is enough to be visible, enough to be scientifically tractable, enough to be the subject of a story as long and as specific as the one we have been telling tonight. It is enough to look at someone from the Northwest Highlands and see, if you know what you are looking at, the faces of the people who first arrived when the glaciers retreated. To see, in the pale eyes and the specific colouring and the particular set of the jaw, the visible expression of 12,000 years of a relationship between a specific population and a specific piece of the earth that is among the most demanding and most beautiful places in the world. The face of Scotland is the face of that relationship. And now, having traced it all the way from the genetic mechanisms of melanin production to the social mechanisms of the clan system, from the Mesolithic hunters following the ice to the Victorian clearances and the modern diaspora, you know something of why it looks the way it looks, and something of what it cost, and what it means, and why it matters. That is a great deal to take into sleep. But the drifting mind can hold more than the waking mind sometimes thinks, and the specific details of ancient DNA and gene frequency distributions, and Pictish symbol stones, and Atlantic sea routes, can dissolve into something simpler and more durable, as the body lets go of the day and the mind begins its own slow journey into the dark. What remains is the essential thing, a specific people in a specific place over a very long time, a face that is the record of that time, a story that is still being written, in the lives of the living and in the genomes that will be inherited by generations not yet born, out in the diaspora and in the highland glens, wherever the specific combination of ancestry and environment and cultural history that made Scotland comes together again in a new time and a new set of circumstances. The mountains that shaped them are still there. The sea that bounded them is still there. The light that selected for their pale eyes and their translucent skin still comes in at that same low angle every evening over the Torridonian hills. And somewhere in the genome of every person who carries that ancestry, whatever mix of other ancestries surrounds it, those 12,000 years are still present, waiting to be expressed in the right conditions, recognizable to anyone who knows what to look for and has the patience to see it clearly. That is the whole story, and it is enough. There is a dimension of the Scottish distinctiveness question that sits at the intersection of the firmly established and the genuinely speculative, and it involves the Atlantic maritime world of the early Bronze Age in a way that has implications not just for understanding Scotland, but for understanding the range of human movement and contact that was possible in a period when we often assume sea travel was primitive and limited to short hops between visible shores. The evidence for sustained Atlantic maritime contact during the Neolithic and early Bronze Age is primarily archaeological and genetic, and it is strong enough in both dimensions that it is no longer seriously disputed in its broad outlines. What is still being worked out is the specific mechanisms, the scale and regularity of the contact, the direction of the primary flows of people and goods and ideas, and the extent to which specific communities along the Atlantic facade were in active, sustained relationship with each other, rather than simply showing the cumulative effects of long, slow genetic drift along a shared coastline. The genetic evidence, as we have discussed, shows that Neolithic populations from Orkney show affinities with Iberian Neolithic populations that are closer than their affinities with some continental European contemporaries. This is not an artifact of poor sampling or statistical noise. It is a robust finding that has been replicated across multiple studies using different analytical approaches. The most parsimonious interpretation is that the Atlantic coastal route, running from the Iberian Peninsula up through Brittany and the western British Isles to Orkney, was a route of active population movement and genetic exchange during the Neolithic period, sustained over a timescale of centuries. The archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. The megalithic monument tradition along the Atlantic facade shows striking parallels in construction techniques, in the use of astronomical alignment, and in the associated material culture that are difficult to explain through independent invention at multiple locations. The passage tomb tradition in particular, the construction of elaborate stone chambers with astronomically aligned entrance passages through which light enters only at specific times of year, appears at Newgrange in Ireland, at Mace Howe in Orkney, in the passage Tombs of Brittany, and at Iberian sites, all within a period that suggests sustained contact and exchange of both people and ideas rather than isolated parallel development. The Orcadian monuments are particularly important in this context because of their exceptional preservation and the richness of the archaeological context surrounding them. The complex at the Ness of Brodgar, which is still being excavated, and which has so far revealed a scale and architectural sophistication that surprised even experienced archaeologists, was constructed by a population that was evidently in contact with building traditions that extended far beyond the relatively small islands it occupied. The stones used at some sites came from specific outcrops that required transport by sea. The knowledge encoded in the astronomical alignments required sustained observation and transmission across generations. The scale of the construction required a labour mobilisation that went beyond the immediate population of the islands, suggesting either a larger regional population contributing to the effort or a degree of social organisation and surplus that enabled a smaller population to sustain a major construction project over extended time. All of this points to the Orcadian Neolithic communities being participants in a maritime world that was more extensive and more actively maintained than most popular accounts of the Neolithic suggest. And if that maritime world connected Orkney to Iberia through a chain of Atlantic coastal communities, then the genetic affinities we see between Orcadian Neolithic genomes and Iberian Neolithic genomes are simply what you would expect from regular population exchange along an active maritime route. This matters for the Scottish distinctiveness question because it places the distinctive genetic character of the northern Scottish population within a much larger Atlantic context. The characteristics that distinguish Scotland from the rest of northwestern Europe, the elevated Mesolithic ancestry, the specific pigmentation gene frequencies, the particular morphological features that physical anthropologists have noted, are not exclusively Scottish characteristics. They are characteristics of the Atlantic maritime world more broadly, preserved at highest frequency in Scotland because the geographic barriers of the Highland landscape provided additional protection against the diluting effects of later inland migrations. The Scots are the most concentrated expression of an Atlantic genetic heritage that once extended from Iberia to Scandinavia along the western coastal route. The Basque people, whose linguistic isolation and genetic distinctiveness we noted earlier, are another concentrated expression of the same ancient Atlantic heritage, preserved in their case by the Pyrenean barrier rather than by the Scottish mountain barrier. The Welsh and the Irish show intermediate expressions, more diluted than the Scottish Highland population, but still carrying elevated proportions of the same ancient Atlantic ancestry components. This is the Atlantic facade dimension of the Scottish story, and it situates what might otherwise seem like a purely local distinctiveness within a much larger framework of ancient human diversity and its differential preservation across different geographic contexts. The skull studies that physical anthropologists conducted in the 19th and early 20th centuries across the British Isles, whatever their methodological limitations and their subsequent misinterpretation in racialist frameworks, captured something real about the regional variation in craniometric characteristics that we can now begin to interpret correctly in the light of ancient DNA. The researchers who noted that skulls from the Scottish Highlands differed measurably from skulls from the English Midlands were observing genuine differences. They did not have the conceptual tools to understand those differences as the expression of different ancestry proportions reflecting different population histories, so they expressed them in the racial typology that was the available framework at the time. Correcting the interpretive framework does not mean discarding the underlying observation. The craniometric differences are real. The Highland skulls show elevated frequencies of the longer, narrower forms associated with the older Atlantic Mesolithic ancestry, while the English Midland skulls show elevated frequencies of the broader forms associated with the heavier Neolithic and Bronze Age steppe admixture. This is exactly what the ancient DNA data predicts from the different ancestry proportions in the two populations. The post-war rejection of race science, which was both necessary and correct as a rejection of the political and ethical conclusions that had been drawn from population differences, unfortunately also discouraged the scientific study of those population differences in ways that were sometimes scientifically unwarranted. The population differences are real and scientifically interesting. What is wrong is the use of those differences to rank populations in any hierarchy of value or capacity, and the conflation of observed variation with genetic determinism about behaviors and abilities that the evidence does not support. The modern approach, which the ancient DNA revolution has made possible in a scientifically rigorous form, is to study population differences in their actual specificity, to trace them back to their historical causes, and to interpret them as what they are, the product of specific histories in specific places, without loading them with evaluative weight that the data does not support. This is what we have been doing throughout this exploration. The Scottish distinctiveness is real. It has specific causes that we can trace with increasing precision. Those causes are geographic, demographic, cultural, and biological, all interacting over 12,000 years to produce outcomes that are visible in the faces of living people. The distinctiveness does not rank the Scottish people above or below anyone else in any dimension that matters humanly. It simply makes them specifically themselves, in the way that every population is specifically itself when understood in the full depth of its particular history. The story of how Scotland came to look like Scotland is, in this light, a a story that illuminates the general principles by which all human diversity is generated and preserved. Understanding it helps us understand not just Scotland, but the broader processes of human population history, the mechanisms by which geography, time, culture, and biology interact to produce the magnificent diversity of human populations that exists in the world today. And that diversity, the full range of it, the entire spectrum from the pale-eyed Highland Scots to the populations at the opposite end of every variable we have discussed, is one of the most interesting things about the human species. It is the product of hundreds of thousands of years of people living in different places, meeting different challenges, developing different solutions, and leaving in the physical characteristics of their descendants the record of all of that lived experience. Every face in the world is a time capsule. Some are just more specific in what they contain than others, because some populations have had more time in a more bounded space to accumulate the particular character that their specific history created. Scotland is one of those more specific cases. And the specificity, once you understand it, is a kind of gift, a window into the deep past that is available to anyone who knows how to look at it and is willing to trace the lines of the story all the way back to where they begin, which is in the ice, 12,000 years ago, and in the first humans who walked onto the newly exposed ground behind the retreating glaciers and looked at the mountains and the sea and the sky and found them worth staying for. The patience of that staying, across every generation that followed, is the real story. Not the dramatic moments, not the famous battles and the famous kings and the famous massacres, though those are part of it too. The real story is the ordinary persistence, the daily decisions to remain in a difficult and demanding and beautiful place, made by ordinary people who were simply living their lives, generation after generation, for 12,000 years. And the result of that ordinary persistence, expressed in the faces of the people who are still there and the people who carried the inheritance away into the diaspora, is one of the most specific and deep expressions of what it means for a place to become part of a people. The mountains are still there. The light is still the same at that low Atlantic angle. And in the genome of every person who carries that ancestry, wherever in the world they happen to be tonight, the 12,000 years are still present. That is worth knowing. That is worth taking into sleep and finding there, in the drifting space between waking and dreaming, a quiet kind of recognition, not of a specific place or a specific time, but of the extraordinary depth of the ordinary human story and the way it writes itself into us, whether we know it or not, whether we have been told it or not, whether we are awake to it or drifting gently away from it, as the details soften and the images blur. And what remains is simply the sense of having been somewhere real and deep and worth the visit. Drift now. The story is told. The mountains will be there in the morning. The question of what happens to a genetic legacy when it disperses into a world that has no particular reason to preserve it is one that haunts any story about population distinctiveness. The logic of mixing, the mathematics of how gene frequencies change when populations combine, suggests that distinctiveness is always temporary, always in the process of being averaged out by the encounters that populations inevitably have with each other across time. The question is only how long it takes, and the answer depends on how effectively the barriers that maintained the distinctiveness continue to operate. For Scotland, those barriers have been weakening steadily since the early modern period. The Union of the Crowns in 1603, the Acts of Union in 1707, the economic integration of Highland Scotland into the broader British economy through the clearances and the Industrial Revolution, the spread of English language education, the development of road and rail links that made the remote corners of the Highlands accessible in ways they had never been before, all of these have progressively reduced the degree of demographic isolation that had maintained the genetic distinctiveness of the Highland and Island populations. The pace of change has accelerated in the post-war period, with increased mobility, tourism, inward migration from other parts of Britain and from the wider world, and the continued outward migration of young people from rural communities to urban centres. The result is that the specific, fine-grained genetic distinctiveness that characterized the traditional Highland communities is being diluted in the modern period in ways that are measurable and ongoing. This is not a catastrophe, and it is not anyone's specific fault. It is the ordinary outcome of the ordinary processes of human mobility and cultural exchange that have always, over sufficiently long timescales, reduced local genetic distinctiveness in favour of broader regional homogeneity. What is specific to the Scottish situation is the timescale of the distinctiveness that is being diluted. Most European populations show some degree of fine-grained regional genetic structure, but few show the combination of very ancient founding ancestry and sustained geographic isolation that gave the Scottish Highland and Island populations their particular depth of distinctiveness. The dilution that is happening in modern Scotland is not the same kind of dilution that happened when the Bronze Age steppe ancestry modified the Neolithic gene pool. That was a modification from outside, bringing in new ancestry that combined with and partially replaced the existing. The modern dilution is more like the gradual blurring of a detailed image, as the pixels that give it its sharpness are replaced by a more uniform distribution. The scientific value of the existing distinctiveness, as material for understanding the deep history of European populations, gives a particular urgency to the work of mapping it in detail, while it is still sufficiently concentrated in specific communities to be tractable. The ancient DNA researchers working on Scottish Neolithic and Bronze Age samples are doing essential work, but the modern population genetics of living Scottish communities, particularly the rural Highland and Island communities, where the traditional demographic structure is still most intact, is equally important for understanding the endpoints of the 12,000-year process that the ancient DNA is tracing. What studies have been completed on the genetics of contemporary Highland and Island populations have consistently confirmed the deep ancestry component at elevated frequencies in those communities, validating the ancient DNA picture from a different direction. Orcadians, Hebrideans, and communities in the Northwest Highlands show, in their modern genomes, the kind of elevated ancient European ancestry proportions that you would predict from the ancient DNA record and from the geographic isolation history. This validation of the expected pattern is reassuring scientifically, but it also underlines that the window for studying this population genetic structure in its most intact form is not infinite. The communities that preserve the highest proportions of the ancient ancestry are also among the most economically vulnerable communities in Scotland, the ones most affected by depopulation, aging population structures, and the economic pressures that make it difficult for young people to stay. This is a pattern that repeats itself in cases of population genetic distinctiveness around the world. The populations that are most genetically distinctive, because they have been most isolated by geography and history, are also often the populations that have been most economically marginalized by the same factors that created their isolation. The distinctiveness and the marginalization often have the same underlying cause. Understanding this connection between geographic isolation, population genetic distinctiveness, and economic vulnerability is important for anyone who cares about both the scientific question and the human question. The genetic distinctiveness of the Highland communities is not a product of anything that the communities did or chose. It is a product of where they are and how long they have been there, the same factors that make their economic situation precarious in a modern world that rewards connectivity over isolation. Treating these communities with the respect and support that any population deserves is not only ethically right, it also happens to serve the scientific interest in preserving access to the genetic history they carry. The broader lesson here, which extends well beyond the Scottish case, is that human genetic diversity and human cultural diversity tend to co-occur and to have the same underlying causes. The populations that are most genetically distinctive are often also the most linguistically distinctive, the most culturally specific, the holders of the most specialized ecological knowledge of their particular landscapes. The loss of any of these dimensions of diversity is a loss of information about the range of human possibility, about the variety of solutions that human populations have found to the challenges of living in specific environments over long timescales. The story of Scotland's genetic distinctiveness is, in this sense, a story that connects to the broader story of human diversity and its value, not in a vague, sentimental sense, in a specific and scientifically grounded sense that recognizes the concrete information content of diverse populations and the concrete loss that occurs when that diversity is reduced through the combination of economic pressures, political marginalization, and the ordinary entropy of population mixing. The faces of the people who carry this ancient Atlantic ancestry, whether they live in the glens where their ancestors have lived for generations, or whether they are scattered across the diaspora, carrying that ancestry into new contexts, are worth looking at with the full understanding of what they represent. Not because they are more beautiful or more important than any other faces, but because they are the visible surface of something ancient and specific and genuinely worth knowing. 12,000 years of the Atlantic Northwest, written in skin and eye color and the specific structure of bone, written in the frequencies of gene variants that track back to the first people who walked into post-glacial Scotland and found it worth staying in. Written in the long, slow record of what happens when people and place engage with each other for long enough that the engagement becomes mutual, when the place enters the people as fully as the people entered the place. That is the story. That is the face. And now, having told it in as much detail as the night will hold, it is time to let it rest, to let the images settle and the connections soften and the details blur into the kind of half-formed knowing that sleep produces when it distills the specific into the essential. The essential thing is simple. The Scottish people look the way they look because of where they are and how long they have been there and what happened to them along the way. The same is true of every human population. The difference is only in the specifics, and the specifics, in Scotland's case, are 12,000 years deep and still partially legible in the living faces of the people who inherited them. That is worth knowing. That is worth having spent the night on. And now it is time to sleep. The question of consciousness and place, of what it means to belong to somewhere at the level of the genome, is one that researchers have only recently begun to be able to ask in scientific, rather than poetic terms. For most of human history, the sense that a landscape was written into the people who inhabited it was expressed through myth, through the traditions that said certain families were of a place in some deeper sense than simple residence. Those traditions were expressing, in the language available to them, something that the science is now beginning to be able to describe in more precise terms. When an Orcadian stands at the edge of the Bruff of Bearsay on a particular evening in late October, when the light is coming in at the angle it comes in at in the northern latitudes at that time of year, something specific is happening in the interaction between that person and that environment that goes beyond the experience of a visitor from a more southerly latitude. The visitor's eyes, calibrated to a different UV environment, process the light differently. The visitor's skin, melanin-rich from selection in a more UV-intensive environment, responds differently to the low-angle Atlantic light. The visitor's body temperature regulation, adapted to different thermal conditions, interprets the wind off the North Atlantic with a different baseline. None of this is mystical. All of it is biological, and the biology is the accumulated outcome of the history we have been tracing throughout this exploration. The Orcadians' response to that specific light at that specific angle is the response of a body that has been shaped by the selection pressures of that specific light angle across 12,000 years of ancestors who lived under it. The responsiveness is in the genome. The genome was written by the environment. The environment and the genome are, at this level of analysis, aspects of a single extended system that includes both the landscape and the people who have been shaped by it. This is what 12,000 years of reciprocal shaping produces, a relationship that is no longer separable into the landscape part and the people part. A relationship in which the people are an expression of the landscape in the same sense that the heather is an expression of the acid soil and the ancient gneiss. The heather did not choose the soil. The people did not choose the landscape. But across enough generations, both became what the interaction between them produced. And now, fully traced and fully understood in the depth that one night's telling can achieve, the story settles. The specific details of ancient DNA and Atlantic maritime contact and Pictish symbol systems and clan genealogy and the genetics of melanin production have done their work, building the picture of why Scottish people look the way they look, a picture that is as complete as the evidence available allows it to be, and more complete than most people who have asked the question have previously encountered. What you carry away from this, into sleep and into the days that follow, is up to you. The details will blur in the way all details blur, but the shape of the story will remain, a specific people in a specific place across a very specific kind of time, a face that is the record of that time. A history that is still being written in the genomes of living people and the faces of generations not yet born. The mountains will be there in the morning. The sea will be where it has always been. And somewhere in the northwest of an island at the edge of Europe, the light will come in at that same low angle that it has come in at for 12,000 years, falling on faces that, if you know how to see them, tell the whole story without a word. Sleep now. There is one final thing worth saying before the silence closes in. The story of why the Scots look different from every other European people is, at its deepest level, a story about what happens when you give a small group of remarkable animals exactly the right combination of difficulty and beauty in a landscape, and then leave them alone long enough for the landscape to write itself into them completely. The difficulty shaped the genome through the specific selective pressures of a demanding environment. The beauty shaped the culture through the specific aesthetic relationship that develops between people and a place that rewards attention and punishes carelessness. Both dimensions of the shaping are visible in the people who resulted. The genome that produced the pale eyes and the particular coloring is the difficulty made biological. The culture that produced the poetry and the music and the genealogical tradition is the beauty made human. And both of them, the biology and the culture, are what you see when you look at a Scottish face and feel the particular quality of attention that is trained by 12,000 years of a landscape that demanded it. That is the whole answer. Carry it gently into sleep. The mountains hold the story now. The glaciers wrote the first chapter, and the people wrote every chapter after. Both are still there, in the stone and in the face, inseparable and complete. Rest, always.